People in medieval Europe lived their entire lives wrapped in a level of filth we would consider unthinkable. Yet to them, dirt was comfort, odour was identity, and cleanliness was a privilege almost no one touched. Every street, every home, every body carried a story hidden beneath layers of grime. Some of those stories are disturbing, others are strangely ordinary. Tonight, you will walk through that world exactly as they did. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step into a medieval settlement with the eyes of someone who believes cleanliness is a basic expectation, the first impression would be a quiet shock that arrives without drama. The air itself carried the weight of daily life in a world where personal hygiene was never a priority. People moved through narrow lanes without noticing the layers of dirt on their clothes or the steady smell that rose from bodies accustomed to labour. Crowds, and the absence of bathing. What seems unbearable now was simply a familiar element of the environment for them. As ordinary as the sound of footsteps on packed earth, cleanliness was not a value woven into their routines. Survival mattered more, and anything beyond that was considered unnecessary. Water, although present in rivers and streams, there was not trusted. The belief that water carried harmful spirits or illness made bathing feel less like a comfort and more like a risk. Opening the pores of the skin, it was said, allowed dangerous influences to slip inside the body. As a result, people avoided washing, unless circumstances forced them to. Baths were not symbols of care or health. They were moments viewed with suspicion, reserved for rare occasions or specific rituals rather than everyday living. The body adjusted to neglect, because neglect was the norm. Villages and towns grew without planning for sanitation. Waste and animals shared the same paths as humans. Dirt accumulated on every surface, blending into the background until it became invisible. A modern visitor would notice the layers immediately, but those who lived there no longer recognized them as anything unusual. Clothing trapped odors easily, and the fabric held onto sweat and smoke from cooking fires. People wore the same garments for long stretches, seeing no reason to change them unless torn or soaked through. The idea of being clean was different from the one we hold today. Medieval people often associated cleanliness with moral purity rather than physical care. A person who looked too polished or washed too frequently risked suspicion. Excessive attention to the body suggested vanity or improper behaviour. Even worse, those who appeared unusually clean might draw whispers of witchcraft. Dirt became a marker of humility, a sign someone was grounded in the hardship of ordinary life. In such a world, the absence of bathing was not shameful, but expected. Houses reflected the same mindset. Rooms were small, dark, and poorly ventilated, trapping smells that lingered for days. Floors made of earth absorbed whatever fell onto them. Bedding was rarely washed, and often shared with insects that made their homes in the fabric. Children grew up in this environment, learning early that discomfort was not something to resist, but something to accept. Adults passed this indifference from one generation to another, turning neglect into a cultural inheritance. Travelers described towns where the streets were so narrow that one could touch the houses on both sides at once. Such places collected grime quickly. Rain turned pathways into mud, and crowded, living, pressed people close together. Smells from animals, waste, smoke, and unwashed bodies mixed into a single scent that defined the community. There was no expectation that it should be otherwise. Complaints rarely went beyond quiet resignation, because the concept of clean air as a right did not exist. People believed that illness came from bad air or divine displeasure, rather than from bacteria or poor hygiene. Since their understanding of disease was shaped by theology and superstition, they looked to prayer, charms, or isolation before considering washing as a defense against sickness. A bath might soothe the skin, but it could not cure what they feared most. So they lived with dirt, not out of ignorance alone, but also out of a different logic about how the body interacted with the world. Even when water was available, it was often unsafe. Streams collected waste from animals and households upstream. Wells could be contaminated without anyone realizing it. Clean water required labor, time, and resources that many families did not have. Carrying heavy buckets repeatedly was exhausting work, and fires needed fuel to warm water. A bat, therefore, cost more than most could spare. Families saved water for drinking and cooking, where survival demanded it more directly. Daily routines reflected a minimalist approach to hygiene. People wiped their hands on aprons, rubbed dust from their faces with a cloth, and combed their hair enough to keep it manageable. Anything more was seen as unnecessary effort. Their world rewarded endurance, not comfort. They understood filth as part of existence, not a problem to be solved. The scents and textures of life stayed with them constantly, embedded in their clothing, their homes, and their skin. Looking at medieval hygiene with modern expectations is unsettling because it reveals how deeply our assumptions depend on circumstances. What we view as basic care was, for them, a luxury rooted in different beliefs. Cleanliness required trust in water, an abundance of supplies, and an understanding of health that did not yet exist. Without these, people accepted dirt as they accepted weather or hunger, an inevitable element of daily life. Their survival did not allow space for refinement, and their worldview offered no reason to seek it. Their habits formed an entire social structure where filth was not only tolerated, but woven into the fabric of identity. It shaped their interactions, their perceptions of others, and their ideas about virtue. Dirt was not a sign of poverty alone. It was a sign of belonging to a world where labor overshadowed comfort. In a sense, their acceptance of grime revealed the clear line between physical necessity and the limited expectations they had for life. In the end, everything about hygiene in this era rested on resignation to a life marked by dirt rather than by cleansing. Yet when one looks closer, that resignation hints at a deeper fear beneath the surface. And the moment people began to question what water might truly carry, an even darker layer of daily survival quietly emerged. Cleanliness, in the world of medieval towns and villages, carried a meaning that had little to do with health or comfort. A person who appeared too washed, too polished, or too attentive to the body invited quiet suspicion from others who had long accepted dirt as a natural layer of life. A surface free of dust or a face scrubbed too often seemed to mark someone as strange, perhaps even threatening, as if stepping outside the shared hardship of the community was itself an act worth questioning. In places where most people lived with the same muddy paths, the same smoky air, and the same constant smells, standing out for being clean was an unnecessary risk. Those who chose, or managed, to stay visibly clean risked having motives assigned to them. Some whispered that unusual neatness came from dealings with forces people could not see, especially in regions where superstition shaped daily judgment. Women were particularly vulnerable. A woman who bathed too frequently or kept her appearance immaculate might be viewed as someone trying to hide unnatural power. The idea that witchcraft could cling to a polished surface while humility clung to grime made dirt a kind of protection, a layer that reassured others you were part of the same uncertain world. Religious teachings and local customs helped reinforce this pattern. Dirt was not only tolerated, but gradually came to symbolize humility and moral restraint. The laboring poor, who rarely had a moment to rest, accepted their state as evidence of their place in society. Those who prayed often linked modesty with physical neglect, believing that focusing too much on the body distracted from spiritual obligations. The refusal to wash became, for some, an expression of devotion. Cleanliness did not elevate someone, it risked lowering them in the eyes of the community. In such an environment, dirt turned into a quiet equalizer. Even wealthy households, though possessing more resources, often lived with layers of soot and odours that clung to their halls. The fabric of their garments absorbed smoke from hearth fires in the same way that the tunics of the poor did. Water was still mistrusted, and bathing still carried the same fears regardless of wealth. Servants might clean rooms, wash linens, and pour scented oils into jars. Yet the underlying habits remained. A noble family could step carefully through life, but they stepped through the same streets, breathed the same air, and shared the same beliefs about preservation and danger. It was not poverty alone that shaped the acceptance of filth. It was a shared logic that placed safety in avoidance rather than in cleansing. Being dirty kept one aligned with common experience. A body marked by labour or dust from the fields suggested honesty and reliability, something the community valued. Those who maintained spotless appearances were seen as distancing themselves from this shared identity, removing themselves from the social fabric. Suspicion filled the gap between those who attempted to rise above the norms and the majority who stayed within them. This suspicion fed into the rigid social dynamics of the time. Polished shoes or a recently washed cloak could be misread as arrogance. People who attempted to maintain cleanliness were sometimes viewed as trying to claim superiority. Such efforts threatened the fragile balance among neighbours who already, by necessity, accepted discomfort as a standard condition. Dirt was not simply a physical state, but also a visual confirmation of one's place, one's humility, and one's adherence to communal expectations. The moral weight placed on dirt extended further. Religious leaders sometimes described physical hardship as a path to spiritual purity. Cleanliness became associated with vanity or indulgence, while bodily neglect suggested discipline. For those who wanted to appear righteous or grounded in faith, filth served as a visible shield. It erased differences between individuals by placing everyone under the same coat of dust, the same unwashed skin, the same lingering smells. Cleanliness, ironically, became a deviation. Even children absorbed these judgments quickly. A child who appeared too neat might be teased or questioned, taught early that the world rewarded endurance more than freshness. What might have been interpreted as care in another era became a reason to stand apart. In the worst way, families did not encourage their children to wash beyond what was necessary. They did not want them to appear strange, delicate, or touched by unfamiliar habits. In many households, washing took place quietly and infrequently. People would avoid discussing it openly, as if admitting to too much interest in personal cleanliness risked exposing them to comments or gossip. The avoidance of water, of soap, of regular bathing, became a silent rule that upheld social order. Dirt became a protective layer, not against disease, but against judgment, mistrust, and potentially dangerous suspicion. As centuries passed, the association deepened. Cleanliness required time, resources, and a shift in belief that most did not have. The luxury of removing grime was not only impractical, but felt unnecessary within the broader structure of life. Dirt never demanded justification, it simply existed. Cleanliness, on the other hand, demanded explanation. Why wash more than the others? What purpose did it serve? Such questions did not lead to admiration. They led to doubt. Much of medieval society relied on this shared acceptance of filth as a marker of safety and belonging. Yet beneath that quiet acceptance lay an unspoken fear of anyone who stepped outside the collective pattern. And when the gaze moved closer to the daily struggle for water itself, the story of dirt shifted into something far more desperate. Rivers and streams that wound through medieval settlements often gave the impression of abundance. Yet anyone who depended on them knew how deceptive that appearance could be. Water moved slowly through these channels, carrying with it the refuse of daily life. Scraps from kitchens, waste from animals, and the remnants of whatever the community discarded without thought. The surface might shimmer under sunlight, but beneath that sheen lay a mix of decay that no one mistook for purity. People walked past these waters each day, aware that they were essential for survival, yet unfit for any act that involved real cleansing. The contamination was not limited to a single source. Animals were slaughtered near the banks, leaving behind blood and offal that seeped into the current. Craftsmen rinsed dyes, ashes, or chemical residues directly into the flow. Children played along the water's edge, their hands and feet stirring layers of sediment mixed with what older generations had learned not to question too closely. The dead were not always buried far from the water either. Storms could disturb makeshift graves, sending more unwelcome matter downstream. With every passing season, the river accumulated a memory of everything that had touched it. Families understood that drawing water for drinking or cooking required caution. Yet even cautious hands were limited by distance. The cleaner sources lie farther away, often beyond farmland, requiring long walks over uneven ground with heavy buckets. Collecting enough water for drinking alone was exhausting. Turning the idea of bathing into a luxury few could justify. The journey itself became part of the burden. Women and children carried the weight back home in slow steps, their arms strained and their clothing damp from spilling water that had cost too much effort to obtain. The labor did not end with the walk. Water had to be stored carefully to keep it from becoming stagnant. Containers were scarce, often made from wood or pottery that absorbed smells or leaked over time. Heating water required fuel, wood, straw, or whatever could be gathered. And fuel was yet another resource not to be wasted. A bath demanded more than cleanliness. It demanded time, energy, and materials that had more pressing uses in a life defined by scarcity. Clean water became something measured, rationed, and assigned to tasks deemed essential for survival. The poor felt these limitations most sharply. Their homes stood closest to the dirtiest parts of the waterway, where runoff collected in dark pools. Even when they tried, they could not escape the contamination that shaped their lives. They drank what they had, cooked with what remained, and washed only when necessary. Bathing, in this context, was not a matter of choice, but of impossibility. Clean water became an imagined comfort, spoken of, perhaps, but rarely seen. Those with greater resources did not escape the problem either. Wealth allowed for better storage, deeper wells, and occasional access to cleaner sources. But it did not change the nature of the environment. Wells could be tainted by underground seepage. Private water sources could dry up in harsh seasons. Even the privileged approached bathing with hesitation, aware that water might carry unseen dangers. Dirt remained familiar. Water did not inspire trust. Communities developed habits around this scarcity. People rinsed their hands before meals when possible, using minimal amounts of water to avoid waste. Clothing was shaken out rather than washed. Dishes were wiped instead of scrubbed. The carefulness became part of identity, shaping a culture where conserving water mattered more than removing grime. The idea of washing regularly and thoroughly belonged to a distant world, one without the constant fear of using more than one could replace. The irony of medieval life lay in the visibility of water paired with the inability to use it. Rivers cut through fields, flowed under bridges, and traced paths through forests. Yet they offered little comfort. The people who lived beside them learned to view them as both essential and unreliable, a source of life and a carrier of illness. They endured the contradiction because endurance was what the era demanded from them. Bathing became a symbol of a world beyond their reach, not because they lacked desire, but because they lacked means. In many ways, scarcity created its own logic. When water was difficult to gather, anything that required large quantities felt indulgent. To bathe was to spend what could not easily be recovered. It disrupted routines built on conserving resources. It challenged systems that had formed over generations. Cleanliness, in this context, was less a virtue than a disruption to the natural order of things. The dirt that clung to people was not simply a result of neglect. It was evidence of a life lived within the strict boundaries of necessity. Even the seasons shaped expectations. In winter, the cold made water nearly impossible to collect or heat. In summer, droughts reduced trickles to stagnant puddles. The cycle reinforced the idea that water was not meant for comfort. It was something to be fought for, carried, protected, and used sparingly. The body learned to live with grime because grime did not demand effort. Dirt was a constant that did not compete with survival. Communities accepted these limitations as part of their identity. They taught their children that water must be saved, not spent. They told stories of illness traced back to contaminated springs, reinforcing a fear that lingered long after the specific incident was forgotten. People lived in a world where water shaped every decision, every routine, and every expectation of cleanliness. That world left little room for bathing, and the body adapted to its absence without protest. Much of daily life was built around this quiet struggle for water, shaping habits that made filth seem ordinary. Yet beneath those habits lay a deeper dependence on resources that rarely offered true safety. What unsettles most is how fear began to grow around the very act meant to bring relief. Bathing, within the logic of medieval life, was not an act of comfort, but a step toward vulnerability. People believed that warm water loosened the body in ways that invited invisible forces to slip beneath the skin, turning an ordinary wash into a potential threat. The idea that pores could open and allow harmful influences to enter took root deeply, shaping habits across villages and towns. Water, already distrusted for its impurities, became even more unsettling when it was used to soften the body. Safety meant keeping the skin sealed, tomb, and untouched by the risks that warmth introduced. The fear grew stronger during colder seasons. People avoided bathing when the air turned sharp, convinced that exposing a warm body to winter air would draw illness instantly. A chill after washing was not just discomfort, it was interpreted as the earliest sign of something far more dangerous. Families taught each other to protect their bodies by limiting exposure, believing that keeping the skin dry and untouched by water preserved its strength. Illnesses that followed the cold only reinforced these convictions, even when the real causes lay elsewhere. Many households, therefore, turned bathing into a rare ritual rather than a routine. A bath might occur before a festival, a holy day, or a significant family event, but only when circumstances felt controlled enough to reduce the perceived danger. These occasions often involved more preparation than the bathing itself, closing windows to block drafts, warming the room with whatever fuel was available, and ensuring that the body could dry near a fire without attracting cold air. Even then, the act carried tension. People stepped into the water with caution, as if performing something that balanced on a thin line between necessity and risk. In poorer communities, where resources for heating water were scarce, fear mixed easily with practicality. If the cost of a bath included fuel, time, and the risk of sickness, many saw little reason to attempt it. Dirt was familiar and harmless. Water was unpredictable. Families preferred to stay within the safety of known discomfort rather than experiment with a practice that carried uncertain consequences. Those who insisted on bathing too often were viewed with suspicion, not only because it broke with custom, but because it seemed reckless. Stories circulated of people falling ill after washing, further entrenching the belief that bathing weakened the body. These accounts rarely considered the true causes. Contaminated water, cold homes, or underlying sickness. But they satisfied a worldview that already distrusted the act. The idea that a clean body could become a sick body felt logical in a society where most dangers were invisible and poorly understood. People did not need proof. They needed reinforcement for what they already feared. The relationship between water and the body became shaped by caution rather than care. Cleanliness did not signify health. It signified exposure. Those who bathed were expected to rest afterward, wrapped tightly and kept away from drafts. People observed these precautions not because they enjoyed them, but because they believed survival required them. Bathing was something to endure, not embrace. As a result, the body adapted to a rhythm that involved long stretches without washing. Skin collected layers of dust and sweat. Clothing absorbed odors, and hair grew heavy from oils and dirt. These changes did not alarm medieval people. They signaled normalcy. A washed body, by contrast, appeared fragile, stripped of its protective layer. Cleanliness felt like a temporary and delicate state, ideal perhaps for a celebration, but unsafe for everyday life. In wealthier homes, conditions allowed for slightly safer bathing environments. Yet the beliefs remained the same. Wealth did not erase cultural fear. It merely provided more controlled circumstances. Fires burned longer. Rooms stayed warmer. And water was heated more consistently. But people still stepped into the process with caution. Even the privileged viewed a bath as something to prepare for, endure, and recover from, rather than something to enjoy. The shared mindset transcended class, uniting society through its distrust of water and the risks it carried. These habits shaped personal identity as much as communal behavior. People saw themselves as resilient because they avoided practices that seemed to weaken the body. Bathing too often signaled softness or foolishness. Enduring dirt, by contrast, fit the expectation of a world defined by hardship. The idea that washing could bring danger aligned naturally with a life where risk came from unexpected places. Illness, famine, weather, or conflict over generations. These beliefs solidified into unspoken rules. Children learned early that water was to be respected and avoided in equal measure. They were taught the right moments to wash and the right precautions to take afterward. Cleanliness became ceremonial, not habitual. In this framework, dirt was not simply an accident of life, but a protective barrier, something that confirmed a person understood the world and its dangers. Much of the hesitation surrounding bathing arose not from ignorance, but from a deep desire to preserve the body in a hostile environment. Yet beneath that cautious logic lay a restless search for safety in a world that offered little of it. Even more revealing is how people soon turned to methods that avoided water altogether while pretending to cleanse. Public bathhouses, once intended as rare spaces where people could temporarily escape the grime of daily life, gradually took on a reputation that overshadowed their original purpose. The dim interiors, warmed by steam and crowded with bodies, created an environment where boundaries blurred more easily than rules could restrain. What began as communal washing turned, in many towns, into an unspoken marketplace for desires that had little to do with hygiene. People slipped in and out without asking questions, and the line between cleansing and indulgence became increasingly difficult to identify. The structure of these bathhouses encouraged ambiguity. Separate rooms, curtained corners, and warm water created pockets where privacy could be bought as easily as a towel. For those who lived without space of their own, the bathhouse offered more than warmth. It offered a setting where transactions of all kinds could occur without the scrutiny of household walls. Over time, the association grew stronger, and these establishments developed reputations that lingered even in towns that tried to maintain order. Visitors learned to look away from certain doors or to ignore the quiet movements in dim corridors. The church viewed these developments with alarm. Religious leaders, already wary of bathing for its perceived indulgence, saw in bathhouses a breeding ground for moral decay. Sermons warned that the mixture of heat, water, and bare skin stirred desires that threatened spiritual discipline. Bathing, once already considered unnecessary, now appeared dangerous in an entirely different way. Communities absorbed these concerns, and suspicion grew around anyone who visited such places too often or stayed too long. Cleanliness itself became entangled with accusations of impropriety. Efforts to control the behavior inside bathhouses did little to change their reputation. Authorities posted rules, increased supervision, or tried to divide spaces more strictly. But the demand for discreet encounters did not vanish. Instead, people adapted, exploiting the same shadows and steam that had made the bathhouses appealing in the first place. Transactions continued quietly, tucked between moments of washing or resting. Even those who came solely to bathe found themselves sharing space with activities they preferred not to acknowledge. As the association between bathing and immorality solidified, pressure mounted to close these establishments altogether. Local leaders found it easier to eliminate the problem than to reform it. Some bathhouses were demolished outright, replaced with markets or storage areas. Others were simply abandoned, left to decay until their walls collapsed or were repurposed for unrelated uses. What had once been rare spaces of communal cleansing became symbols of excess, temptation, and disruption. Their disappearance reinforced the belief that water and cleanliness were luxuries intertwined with moral danger. For ordinary people, the closing of bathhouses meant losing one of the few public places where washing was possible. Those who lacked private facilities returned permanently to the routines of wiping, dusting, and enduring the dirt of daily life. Few protested the closures openly. The growing reputation of these places made it difficult to argue for their survival. Bathing once again retreated into secrecy, discomfort, or absence. The brief experiment with shared cleanliness ended, leaving behind stories more vivid than the walls that once held them. The legacy of these bathhouses did not fade quickly. Even generations later, communities spoke of them with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the behaviors that once took place inside. Parents warned their children about the dangers of indulgence, using the vanished bathhouses as reminders of how quickly a useful facility could become corrupted. Memories blurred, but the moral lesson persisted. Cleanliness was not only unnecessary, but it could also invite trouble. This suspicion shaped the collective mindset. People who bathed too frequently risked appearing connected to spaces that no longer existed, but still cast a long shadow. Avoiding water became a form of self-protection, not just against illness or cold, but against judgment. Filth, once a sign of necessity, now also become a marker of virtue, proving that one avoided places where temptation had once flourished. The disappearance of bathhouses reinforced the broader belief that the safest approach to washing was restraint. Much of the distrust surrounding public bathhouses grew from the way their purpose slipped beyond communal cleansing into something far less acceptable. Yet beneath that shift lay a deeper anxiety about bodies, desire, and control within a society already wary of indulgence. What emerged afterward was a series of improvised practices that tried to achieve cleanliness without stirring old fears or approaching running water at all. In communities where bathing carried more risk than relief, people turned to methods that allowed them to maintain the appearance of cleanliness without ever confronting the dangers they associated with water. These practices grew from necessity, fear, and habit, shaped by the belief that avoiding water preserved the body while still allowing individuals to meet the minimal expectations of social life. What emerged was a collection of dry routines, quiet gestures repeated across generations, each one designed to imitate cleansing while keeping the skin untouched by what they considered unsafe. The simplest method involved wiping the body with damp cloths. Households kept pieces of linen or wool soaked lightly in whatever water they could spare, then wrung them until only a cool trace remained. People pressed these cloths to their faces, necks, and hands, moving slowly, as if performing a ritual that hovered just short of bathing. The cloth absorbed sweat and dust, offering a small degree of freshness without exposing the body to the risks of fully opening the pores. Even this modest practice felt cautious. The cloth was never too wet, the process never too thorough, and the goal was never actual cleanliness, only improvement. Others turned to powders. These substances, ground herbs, crushed flowers, ash sifted until fine, or mixtures sold at markets, served as a barrier against odor rather than a method of washing. People rubbed them along the arms, across the chest, or behind the neck, letting the grains settle into the skin like an additional layer. When the powders carried pleasant scents, they masked the smell of unwashed bodies just enough to avoid comment. When they did not, they still offered a texture that felt cleaner than bare skin. The powders were not meant to remove dirt, they were meant to replace its presence with something more acceptable. Ash played a significant role in this imitation of cleansing. Because it absorbed oils, people believed it could pull impurities from the body. They treated it with a kind of respect, gathering ash carefully from hearths and storing it in small containers. Though its grey colour clung visibly to the skin, it provided a sensation of dryness that felt safer than water's touch. To many, this dryness signalled purity, even if the underlying grime remained. Ash did not threaten to open the body to illness. It settled on the surface, forming a dull coating that reassured more than it cleaned. Herbs were used not just for their scents, but for the symbolic protection they were thought to offer. Plants associated with warding off sickness, rosemary, salvia, and thyme, were crushed and rubbed over the skin, leaving faint traces of fragrance mixed with dust. People believed these herbs could shield the body from harmful air or unseen influences, strengthening the surface that water threatened to weaken. The act of applying herbs felt closer to preservation than hygiene, aligning with traditions that valued bodily endurance over freshness. In many households, especially poorer ones, the illusion of cleanliness depended more on appearance than on scent. People sprinkled white powders over their skin to lighten the tone, or brushed cloths coated in chalky residue across their clothes. These practices softened harsh lines, reduced visible dirt, and gave the impression of care even when true cleansing had not occurred. Clothing, already worn for long stretches, received similar treatment. A fresh layer of powder or vigorous shaking could transform a garment enough to resemble something reasonably presentable. Fabric also served as a tool for hiding what could not be removed. People layered cloth beneath their clothing to absorb sweat and trap odors before they reached the outer garment. This lining, once heavy with use, was shaken out or left to air rather than washed. Some wrapped themselves in additional layers of cloth when visiting public places, using textile rather than water to manage the state of their bodies. These methods added weight to daily life, but they preserved the illusion of being cleaner than one truly was. Dry routines expanded into social expectations. A person who smelled faintly of herbs or powders signaled that they had taken reasonable steps to care for themselves. Neighbors recognized these signs as responsible behavior. No one expected thorough washing, but they expected acknowledgement of shared discomfort. Dry cleansing became a common language, a way to show respectability without breaking the cultural agreement that water was dangerous. People reinforced each other's habits simply by repeating them. These methods were gentle enough that even children practiced them early. Parents taught their children to dab their faces with a cloth, pat their hands with powder, or hold fragrant bundles of herbs near their clothing. These actions, small and manageable, allowed families to maintain social acceptance while reinforcing the belief that true bathing belonged only to rare occasions. Children learned to avoid too much water, not through instruction, but through imitation, absorbing the rhythm of dry cleansing as naturally as they learned to walk. Dry routines also shaped the way people understood their own bodies. Instead of thinking of the body as something to wash, they viewed it as something to maintain, buffer, and protect. Dirt clung to the skin, but so did the powders and fabrics that defined their daily routines. Cleanliness was not measured by the absence of filth. It was measured by the presence of effort, even if that effort produced only a thin disguise. The short-lived nature of these methods did not bother them. Life itself was short-lived, and practicality mattered more than permanence. The result was a culture where the appearance of cleanliness replaced the pursuit of it. People moved through their days, carrying layers of dust, powder, ash, and sweat, yet considered themselves properly cared for as long as these layers had been arranged with intention. They accepted the limitations of their world and shaped their habits accordingly, finding solutions that fit the fears and constraints they lived within. Much of their daily comfort depended on these small gestures that mimicked cleansing without ever confronting water directly. Yet beneath these improvised solutions lay a growing acceptance of filth as something ordinary, even expected. Further along this path, attention shifted to the hair, where scarcity and fear produced habits that were just as revealing. Hair, in medieval life, carried the weight of long neglect simply because washing it required a commitment a few were willing or able to make. People lived in a world where water was distrusted, fuel was scarce, and illness seemed always near. So, submerging the head in water felt unnecessary at best and risky at worst. Instead of viewing hair as something to refresh, they saw it as another surface that adapted to the environment, gathering dust, smoke, and oils until these layers became part of its natural state. Washing was reserved for the rare moments when circumstance demanded it, resulting in a practice so infrequent that some people cleaned their hair only a few times in an entire year. This infrequency shaped the texture and appearance of hair in ways that aligned with the expectations of the time. Hair grew heavy with the accumulation of natural oils, which acted as a kind of protection against the elements. The weight was familiar, the sheen, though produced by neglect rather than care, appeared natural to those who had grown accustomed to the dim light of their homes. Whether hair hung loose, was braided, or wrapped in cloth, its condition rarely provoked comment. To wash it too often risked softening the scalp, inviting sickness, or simply wasting resources needed elsewhere. When cleansing did occur, people turned to substitutes that allowed them to avoid large amounts of water. Wine, slightly acidic and easier to heat in small quantities, was occasionally poured through the hair to break down some of the accumulated oils. The scent it left behind lingered briefly before fading into the ambient smells of daily life. Herbs provided another path for cleaning. Rosemary, lavender, say, and other plants were boiled or crushed, releasing oils that could be massaged into the scalp. These mixtures helped mask odors rather than remove them, but the illusion of freshness was often enough to satisfy the limited expectations of the time. Powders also played a role. People sifted fine dusts made from ground roots, crushed flowers, or chalk into their hair, rubbing them gently to absorb grease. Afterward, the hair was shaken or combed to remove the excess, a process that left behind a residue that felt lighter than the oils it replaced. These powders gave the impression of care despite doing little to confront the underlying grime. The practice became common, shaping a cultural understanding of cleanliness that relied more on appearances than on actual washing. Combs were used sparingly, not as tools of daily grooming, but as instruments with a more pressing purpose: managing lice. Chiron were not seen as a sign of neglect or social failure. They were considered persistent companions in a life shaped by close quarters. Infrequent washing and heavy fabrics. Families shared combs designed specifically for removing lice, pulling them slowly through the hair in hopes of catching the insects before they multiplied too quickly. This ritual did not eliminate the problem. It merely delayed its escalation, offering brief comfort before the inevitable return. People accepted lice with a kind of resignation. The conditions of their environment, crowded homes, infrequent washing, and shared bedding, made complete prevention impossible. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their play and rest, bringing them into constant contact with others. Adults carried the insects as well, though they rarely discussed the matter openly. Lice existed as another inconvenience in a world defined by hardship. Handled quietly, without the expectation of resolution, hair coverings became part of the strategy for managing neglect. Scarves, hoods, and caps concealed the state of the hair, absorbing oils and odors that might otherwise spread. These coverings also protected the scalp from cold air, reinforcing the belief that exposing the head too often invited sickness. People wore them indoors and outdoors, during labor and rest, allowing hair to remain hidden except during the rare moments when grooming occurred. The coverings collected their own layers of grime, but because they served as buffers, they reduced the need to wash the hair beneath. The infrequency of washing shaped more than appearance. It influenced how people understood the relationship between body and environment. Hair felt like a natural extension of their surroundings, absorbing whatever the world offered: smoke from hearths, dust from fields, and the subtle scent of long-worn clothing. Caring for it was less about cleansing and more about maintaining balance within a life that offered few opportunities to change the conditions around them. Cleanliness, when achieved, was temporary. Neglect, by contrast, was stable and predictable. Some households attempted more thorough care on special occasions. Weddings, festivals, or major religious events provided the rare justification for washing hair fully. Even then, the act involved preparation, heating water, mixing herbs, closing windows to avoid drafts, and allowing hours for drying. These moments reminded people what fresh hair felt like, though the sensation disappeared quickly as daily routines resumed. The memory lingered, but the practice did not grow more frequent. The world they lived in did not support such indulgence. Over time, the appearance of hair became intertwined with ideas of identity and resilience. Greasy strands or tangled braids did not signify neglect. They signaled alignment with the norms of a society built on endurance. To look overly washed or scented risked appearing fragile or frivolous. Those who persisted in cleansing, too, often attracted attention they rarely desired. It was better, many felt, to carry the natural signs of effort and labor openly, rather than disrupt the rhythms that shaped communal life. In this context, grooming transformed into a balance between concealment and acceptance. People combed enough to manage discomfort, scented enough to soften odors, and concealed enough to avoid judgment. They did not expect perfection. They expected survival. Hair reflected the world they lived in, heavy, worn, and shaped by forces beyond personal control. Much of their approach to hair care revealed a deeper willingness to coexist with discomfort rather than challenge it. Yet beneath that acceptance lay a recognition that some problems could not be combed away or disguised. Attention inevitably turned to the insects that thrived not just in hair, but in every corner of their daily lives. Lice, fleas, and mites were not intruders in medieval life. They were constants that threaded themselves through every household, every garment, and every layer of bedding. People lived so closely with these creatures that their presence shaped daily routines as naturally as cooking or tending to animals. No one was exempt. The wealthy scratched their scalps under embroidered hoods, and the poor did the same in coarse wool caps. The insects made little distinction between silk and burlap. Warmth, cloth, and human skin were enough to make any person a suitable home. Lice settled deep into hair, moving between strands with a confidence earned from generations of survival. People felt them more often than they saw them. Small movements along the scalp, a sudden itch that pierced through layers of distraction, or a persistent irritation that returned even after a thorough combing. Children learned to scratch without drawing attention. Adults developed the same quiet reflex. The sensation became a background rhythm, something that accompanied labor in fields, prayers in churches, and meals eaten beside smoky fires. Combs designed specifically for removing lice became essential possessions. These combs, carved from wood or bone, had tightly spaced teeth that dragged through the hair, scraping against the scalp as they caught insects and their eggs. Families passed them down through generations, repairing them carefully when they chipped or split. The act of combing was usually done near light, sunlight, or the dim glow of a hearth, so the person grooming could inspect what the comb revealed. It was a task repeated often, not because it produced lasting results, but because momentary relief mattered enough to justify the effort. People understood that no amount of grooming could eliminate lice entirely. They viewed the insects with a combination of irritation and resigned acknowledgement. Lice did not signify failure or uncleanliness. They signified life in close quarters, heavy fabrics worn for months at a time, and the scarcity of resources needed for thorough cleansing. In a world where water was distrusted and bathing was rare, lice simply thrived. They were companions no one invited, but everyone accommodated. Fleas presented an even greater challenge. While lice lived mostly in the hair, fleas occupied every surface that provided warmth. Beds, with their straw stuffing and thick blankets, offered ideal hiding places. People shook out bedding before sleep, knowing that fleas would scatter only to return moments after the dust settled. The insects bit indiscriminately, leaving small welts on skin that already bore the marks of labor and exposure. People slapped at them absent-mindedly, recognizing the sharp sting of a bite, without interrupting their conversations or work. Noble households faced the same infestations. Elaborate tapestries, layered rugs, and stuffed mattresses created environments where insects multiplied with ease. Servants tried to beat them out of fabrics, hang bedding outdoors, or sprinkle herbs to mask the smell and discourage movement. These efforts brought temporary relief, but no lasting solution. Fleas drifted across floors and climbed drapery with the same persistence that marked their presence in poorer homes. Wealth softened many hardships, but it did nothing to prevent these small creatures from settling into the most comfortable corners of a room. Night brought more contact with insects than daylight did. People lay down knowing their bodies would attract warmth-seeking pests. Sleep became a negotiation, an acceptance of constant interruption in exchange for rest. Some placed herbs near their beds, while others used coarse fabrics that fleas found less appealing. Still, discomfort followed them. The insects fed quietly in the dark, leaving trails of bites that families discussed only when the irritation grew too noticeable to ignore. Communities developed their own approaches to managing infestations, though none promised success. Smoke from smouldering herbs was believed to drive insects away, so families filled rooms with thick fumes that clung to walls long after the fire died. Ash was rubbed onto skin or sprinkled into bedding in hopes of discouraging movement. Houses were swept with more attention to corners and crevices, though insects simply retreated deeper into cracks where brooms could not reach. The struggle resembled maintenance rather than eradication. Even clothing served as a secondary dwelling place for insects. People shook garments vigorously before wearing them, watching small shapes scatter before climbing back into folds later. Layers of fabric, once intended for warmth, became environments that sustained not just people, but the living pests that traveled with them. Overcoats, cloaks, and undergarments alike offered hiding spots that resisted cleaning. Washing these garments required more water and effort than most could spare, so the insects remained, feeding and breeding without interruption. The presence of lice and fleas shaped how people viewed their own bodies. Personal space did not exist in the modern sense. The body was a shared territory between human and pest. People accepted this without expecting change, just as they accepted harsh weather. illness, and hunger. Complaints had little purpose. The insects were too persistent, and the conditions of life favored them too strongly for anyone to envision their absence. These small creatures influenced more than individual comfort. They contributed to the broader atmosphere of medieval life, a world defined by constant itching, small discomforts, and the quiet knowledge that the boundaries between human life and the natural world were thin. People endured these intrusions as part of existence, rarely pausing to imagine a time when insects would not accompany them through every season. Much of medieval daily life unfolded beneath the subtle pressure of pests that people could not escape. Yet beneath this constant irritation lay a deeper truth about how people adapted to what surrounded them. What lingered after these small torments was a quiet neglect of another part of the body, one that revealed even sharper limits to their care. Oral care in medieval life existed only as an afterthought, overshadowed by concerns that seemed more pressing than the quiet decay taking place inside the mouth. People lived in a world where pain was constant, illness familiar, and discomfort expected. So the slow deterioration of teeth rarely drew more than a passing comment. Mouths carried the traces of meals, smoke, herbs, and time itself, and these traces accumulated without resistance. The idea of maintaining healthy teeth belonged to a future no one in their world could imagine. And so the mouth became another part of the body, surrendered to neglect. Without proper tools, people relied on whatever methods felt accessible. There were no toothbrushes shaped for reaching corners or bristles designed to scrape gently. Instead, individuals used small twigs, softened at one end, or rough cloth rubbed along the teeth when they felt compelled to intervene. These improvised tools provided momentary relief, but never removed the deeper build-up that clung to gums and crevices. Few believed that more thorough care was possible. Most accepted that the mouth would follow the same path as everything else. Growing worn, painful, and unreliable with age. Herbs offered a different kind of comfort. People chewed leaves or stems, not to polish their teeth, but to soothe the breath or distract from the taste of decay. Mint, sap, and other plants were chewed until their fibers softened, leaving behind scents that briefly masked odors. The practice had less to do with hygiene and more to do with managing embarrassment. In close-knit homes where people spoke, ate, and slept in the same room, the scent of unwashed breath blended easily into the atmosphere, rarely provoking comment because no one expected better. Charcoal made from burnt wood provided another solution. People crushed it into fine powder and rubbed it along their teeth with fingers or a cloth, believing the roughness might remove the layers that had hardened over time. The black dust stuck to lips and gums, requiring additional effort to wipe away. Yet many found the process worthwhile because it left the mouth feeling slightly cleaner. The perceived improvement was brief, though, as charcoal could not halt the slow erosion beneath the surface. It could only offer the illusion of control. Pain signaled the presence of deeper problems. Toothaches arrived without warning and lingered for days, weeks, or months. People endured them silently, pressing cloths to their cheeks or biting down on sticks to dull the sensation. Some prayed, others waited, and a few sought help from individuals who claimed knowledge of remedies. These remedies ranged from herbal poultices to heated metal instruments, none of which addressed the true causes, but all of which provided rituals that people trusted enough to attempt. The wealthy suffered alongside the poor. Access to better food or larger homes did not protect them from decay. Sugar, though scarce, appeared more often at noble tables, introducing new problems that those in lower classes rarely encountered. The substance clung to teeth, feeding the slow destruction that thrived in a mouth already neglected. Servants brought scented herbs to mask odors in grand halls, but they could not hide the reality that breath grew foul quickly, and teeth, blackened long before age, justified such change. Rot did not discriminate. It crept into the gums and enamel, leaving stains, holes, and infections that spread without resistance. People lost teeth, one by one, often at early ages, accepting the gaps as part of the natural progression of life. Eating became more difficult. Speech changed subtly. Smiles faded into closed-lip expressions that avoided drawing attention to what had been lost. Yet none of this provoked widespread alarm, because no one knew an alternative existed. Pain, after all, was already woven into daily life. Children grew up watching their elders endure these problems, so they approached their own oral discomfort with the same resignation. A sore gum or loose tooth did not demand urgent care. It demanded patience. Many learned to chew on one side of the mouth or avoid certain foods altogether. They adapted instinctively, just as they adapted to cold winters, hard labor, or the insects that lived among their bedding. Survival depended on endurance, on not intervention, and the mouth became a site of quiet endurance. Occasionally, people underwent extractions. These procedures were performed without numbing agents or specialized tools, relying on brute force rather than medical knowledge. The person performing the extraction, sometimes a barber, sometimes a blacksmith, gripped the tooth with whatever could hold it and pulled with swift determination. Screams echoed through homes or market stalls, followed by a brief hush as onlookers registered their relief at not being the one in the chair. The wound bled heavily but was often relieved of the pain, at least for a time, because decay and discomfort were so common. They shaped social expectations. Bad breath did not mark a person as unclean. Missing teeth did not imply failure. These conditions were simply part of existence. People cared about the mouth only when its problems threatened to interrupt work or sleep. Otherwise, they accepted the slow deterioration as inevitable. Kari, when practiced at all, was shallow and brief. In the dim light of medieval homes, mouths rarely revealed their full condition. Shadows softened the appearance of blackened teeth, and people avoided examining their own too closely. Mirrors were rare, and introspection even rarer. As long as they could chew enough to sustain themselves and speak clearly enough to be understood, most considered their oral health sufficient. Appearance carried little weight compared to the demands of survival. Much of medieval oral care reflected a larger pattern of endurance shaped by limited tools and limited expectations. Yet beneath that endurance lay a quiet awareness that the mouth suffered in ways no one fully understood. Even more revealing is how the neglect continued outward, settling into the very fabric that people wore every day. Clothing in medieval life endured a level of use that would feel unimaginable today. People wore the same garments day after day, through work, rest, and travel, until the fabric carried the full imprint of their routines. A single outfit might last an entire season, sometimes longer, not because of preference, but because owning more than a few pieces of clothing was a luxury few could afford. Cloth was expensive, labor-intensive to produce, and difficult to replace. People treated their garments as essential tools, not expressions of individuality, allowing them to absorb sweat, smoke, soil, and weather until the material stiffened under the weight of use. Washing these clothes posed challenges far greater than the inconvenience of time. Water remained a scarce and mistrusted resource, and soap, when available, was harsh, costly, or ineffective. Cleaning a full garment required soaking, scrubbing, rinsing, and drying, all tasks that consumed both labor and fuel. Most families could not spare such effort merely to freshen fabric. Instead, they brushed off dirt, aired garments in the sun, or shook loose whatever surface debris accumulated. These methods created the illusion of cleanliness, while leaving deeper stains and odors untouched. The layers people wore contributed to the condition of their clothing. Undergarments made of linen sat closest to the skin, absorbing sweat, oils, and the grime that settled throughout the day. These garments were designed to protect outer layers from the worst of daily life. Yet they too went long stretches without proper washing. People simply continued wearing them until the fabric grew heavy and stiff. The linen clung to the body, carrying the scent of work, food, and weather, slowly darkening with each passing week. Outer garments suffered similar neglect. Wool cloaks, tunics, and dresses trapped dust and smoke from hearth fires, accumulating odours that lingered through seasons. Because wool was prized for its durability and warmth, people hesitated to wash it for fear of shrinking or damaging it. Instead, they beat the dust from it or aired it outdoors, letting the wind carry away what it could. The remaining residue settled deeper into the fibres, merging with the wearer's environment in a way that few questioned. The climate further shaped these habits. Cold seasons made washing impractical, as wet clothes took days to dry and exposed people to dangerous chills. Even in warmer periods, drying garments required space that many homes did not have. Families lived in cramped quarters, often with livestock nearby, and damp fabric invited mildew and an unpleasant heaviness that clung to the skin. Hanging clothes outdoors offered some relief, but also exposed them to dust and insects, undoing much of the effort. In wealthier households, laundering practices differed only in scale, not in frequency. Servants bore the responsibility of cleaning their master's garments. But even then, washing remained infrequent. Fine fabrics demanded careful handling, and the risk of damage discouraged regular cleaning. Embroidered gowns, fur-lined cloaks, and elaborately dyed textiles were too valuable to expose to harsh soap or excessive water. Instead, scented herbs were stored with clothing, masking odors without removing their source. The result was a refined version of the same neglect found in poorer homes. Clothing also retained the physical impressions of daily life. Knees wore thin from kneeling on hard surfaces. Sleeves darkened from handling tools and food, and hems collected mud from roads and fields. These marks told stories of labour, travel, and survival, shaping an unspoken record of how people moved through their world. No one expected garments to appear pristine. A stain or tear reflected normal use rather than carelessness. Because people wore their clothing for such extended periods, garments adapted to the body in personal ways. Fabric molded to shoulders, elbows, and hips, softening where it rubbed most. The weight of daily routines left permanent creases that made the garments feel familiar, even comforting. Changing clothes too often might have disrupted this sense of continuity, creating a subtle discomfort that people avoided. Storage further influenced the condition of clothing. Garments hung near smoke-darkened walls or lay folded in chests that absorbed moisture from the ground. Pest infestation, moths, beetles, and mites affected stored fabrics, leaving small holes that spread over time. Repair became a common practice, with garments acquiring patches and reinforcing stitches that extended their lifespan. The appearance of these repairs rarely bothered their owners. They signified practicality and endurance. The cumulative effect of these practices shaped how people experienced cleanliness. Clothing rarely felt fresh, yet no one expected it to. Odours blended into the air, unnoticed because everyone carried them. Texture changed gradually, becoming rougher or heavier. But this, too, felt normal. People associated cleanliness not with washing, but with maintaining order. Folding garments neatly, repairing tears, and brushing away surface dirt when possible. These habits reflected a deeper reality about medieval life. Clothing functioned as a barrier between the body and a harsh environment, not as a statement of comfort or hygiene. The fabric absorbed discomfort, so the wearer did not have to confront it directly. What mattered was durability, warmth, and the ability to work without distraction. Much of medieval clothing served as a silent record of hardship, shaped by long use and minimal care. Yet beneath this acceptance lay a world where fabric carried more than dirt. It carried the weight of daily struggle. More telling still was how the neglect reached the very ground they walked on, marking every step with the same quiet endurance. Footwear in medieval life functioned less as protection and more as a thin barrier between the body and a world that never stopped pressing against it. Shoes, when people had them at all, were made from stiff leather or rough pieces of wood shaped just enough to cover the sole. These materials absorbed mud, waste, and moisture with ease, turning every walk into an encounter with whatever the street or field carried. People accepted this contact without hesitation, stepping through layers of dirt and refuse, because the alternative, bare skin meeting the ground directly, offered little improvement. The roads themselves contributed to the condition of medieval shoes. Pathways through towns were rarely paved, instead formed by repeated footsteps that packed soil into uneven tracks. Rain turned these paths into heavy sludge, mixing with animal droppings and discarded waste from homes. Even on dry days, dust and grit clung to surfaces, collecting in grooves of leather and the cracks of wooden soles. Shoes wore down quickly, and repairs were constant. Stitching, patching, and reinforcing became part of maintaining the minimal protection available. For many, shoes were a seasonal luxury rather than a daily certainty. The poor often went barefoot, not by choice, but by necessity. Children learned early to navigate sharp stones, thorns, and cold ground, their feet hardening through repeated exposure. The soles thickened naturally, forming a living armor that resisted some discomfort, but not all. In winter, frost bit into bare toes, and people wrapped their feet in scraps of cloth or straw to soften the impact. These makeshift coverings offered warmth only briefly before absorbing moisture and losing effectiveness. Even those who owned shoes rarely possessed more than one pair. Footwear remained expensive, requiring skilled labor to produce and materials that were not always readily available. People saved their shoes for travel, labor in rough terrain, or harsh weather. Inside homes, they often walked barefoot or in thin linen wrappings that absorbed dirt from floors made of beaten earth. The distinction between indoor and outdoor cleanliness was minimal, the same soil pressed into both surfaces without apology. Socks, as understood today, were uncommon. A few owned simple woolen coverings, but these were precious and easily damaged. Most people's feet remained bare inside their shoes, rubbing against coarse materials that trapped sweat and grime. The moisture softened the skin, making it more vulnerable to cracking, infection, and irritation. Blisters formed and burst, leaving raw patches that stung with every step. Yet people rarely treated these wounds. Movement was essential, and discomfort was simply part of life. The wealthy faced different challenges, but shared similar outcomes. Soft leather shoes, fine boots, and decorative slippers seemed superior, but offered little real protection. These items absorbed filth as quickly as cheaper footwear, and their delicate stitching made them more susceptible to damage. Servants cleaned them when possible, scraping mud from the soles or wiping away visible stains. But the deeper dirt remained embedded. Elegant shoes carried the same odors and residue as common ones once exposed to the streets. Walking through medieval towns tested even the strongest footwear. Animals roamed freely, leaving waste that mixed with scraps of food and refuse. People emptied chamber pots into alleys, adding human waste to the ground. Water from cooking, cleaning, and brewing spilled onto pathways, creating streams that carried filth from one end of the street to the other. Every step through such terrain left marks on shoes and feet alike. The smell of it travelled indoors, settling into fabric and lingering in homes. Blisters, callus, and cracked heels became familiar companions. People felt each imperfection with every movement. But few complained. They simply adapted their gait, shifting weight to reduce pain. The slow formation of thick calluses provided some relief, though these hardened layers often split during cold weather or long walks. Cracks opened into painful fissures that collected dirt, making healing difficult. People endured the discomfort in silence, as tending to their feet required time and resources rarely available. Farmers faced additional challenges. Working barefoot in fields brought them into contact with sharp stubble, insects, and wet soil that clung to the skin. Feet sunk into mud, collecting layers that dried into hard shells, requiring effort to remove. The repeated cycle of soaking, drying, cracking, and hardening shaped feet into tools as much as body parts. The process felt natural within the rhythms of agricultural life, reinforcing the belief that endurance outweighed comfort. In households, foot care was minimal. People rinsed their feet occasionally, wiping away the thickest layers of dirt when it caused discomfort or interfered with sleep. They used cold water from wells or streams, avoiding full immersion for fear of illness. Herbs might be rubbed on particularly sore areas, but healing remained slow. Shoes, once removed, were placed near fires or walls to dry, stiffening as moisture evaporated. Their smell blended with the scent of smoke and domestic life, becoming part of the background. These conditions shaped how people understood the relationship between feet and the world. Feet bore the weight of travel, labor, and survival. They connected people directly to the land, absorbing its texture, temperature, and refuse with every step. Clean feet were a rarity, reserved for moments of ceremony or religion, when washing offered symbolic renewal more than physical comfort. The rest of the time, dirt remained, marking both effort and endurance. Much of medieval life pressed itself into the feet, leaving marks that reflected daily hardship as clearly as any written record. Yet beneath that persistence lay a deeper truth about how people lived in constant contact with their surroundings. More unsettling still was how this disregard extended into public spaces, where cleanliness depended on nothing more than chance. Public behavior around hygiene in medieval towns revealed a world where personal needs and civic spaces blended without clear boundaries. Streets functioned not only as pathways but also as extensions of the home, absorbing waste, water, noise, and movement with little separation. People relieved themselves wherever privacy felt sufficient, behind doors, beside market stalls, or in shadowed corners that offered a moment of concealment. The act did not provoke shock, for everyone understood that designated facilities were rare and often distant. The streets simply bore what life demanded. Human waste joined the constant flow of refuse that defined town life. Families emptied chamber pots from upper windows, letting waste fall onto the street with a dull splash before sinking into the dirt. The warning cries that sometimes accompanied the act were inconsistent, and passers-by learned to walk cautiously, avoiding walls where danger was highest. The ground absorbed the waste slowly, mixing it with mud, animal droppings, and discarded scraps from homes and workshops. Over time, the texture of the street thickened into a pungent layer that clung to shoes, wheels, and the air itself. Rubbish accumulated without pause. Food scraps, bones, broken pottery, and straw were tossed into alleys or left outside doorways, forming piles that grew until rain or foot traffic dispersed them. People did not view this accumulation as disorder. They saw it as the natural cycle of life in crowded settlements. What could not be burned or reused found its way onto the streets, settling into grooves and corners where it decomposed slowly. The resulting odours drifted through neighbourhoods, creating a scent that belonged distinctly to the town. Heavy, sour, and unmistakably alive. Markets intensified these conditions, Vendors sold meat, fish, vegetables, and grains from wooden stalls that lacked proper drainage or storage. As they cleaned and prepared their goods, scraps fell to the ground, mixing with spilled liquids that attracted insects and animals. Dogs, cats, and rats roamed freely, feeding on whatever they found. Their movements contributed to the spread of waste, dragging pieces of food or debris into new areas. Children played nearby, accustomed to the presence of both refuse and creatures that thrived in it. Water channels offered no real relief. Designed to carry away waste, they often overflowed or stagnated, collecting filth that seeped into the surrounding soil. People washed tools, clothing, or hands in these channels when no better option existed, unaware that such actions spread contamination further. The same water sometimes served for cooking or cleaning, depending on availability. When the flow slowed or stopped, the channels emitted odors that joined the general atmosphere, blending seamlessly with the smell of daily life. Public squares reflected the same patterns. Crowds gathered for markets, festivals, or communal announcements, unconcerned by the waste beneath their feet. The presence of refuse did not diminish the importance of these spaces. Instead, people navigated around the worst areas, carving familiar paths through patches that seemed less offensive. Rituals of commerce, celebration, and punishment unfolded upon surfaces shaped by accumulated filth. Yet no one questioned the setting. The square belonged to everyone, and everyone contributed to its condition. Animals added another layer. Horses pulled carts through the streets, leaving droppings that often remained untouched for days. Livestock headed to market or grazing areas passed through towns, adding their own waste to the ground. People stepped aside instinctively, adjusting their path as the animals continued without hesitation. The rhythm of the street included the sound of hooves, the smell of manure, and the sight of steam rising from fresh deposits in cold weather. Insects thrived. Flies swarmed around waste, landing on food, skin, and stalls with equal confidence. Their presence felt constant, hovering near windows and doorways. Drawn by the mixture of scents, people waved them away casually, their gestures practiced and unbothered. Flies did not represent a threat. They represented a familiar nuisance in a world where discomfort rarely surprised anyone. Efforts to manage waste emerged in some towns but remained limited. Street sweepers worked intermittently, pushing refuse into piles that were later collected or left to rot in designated dumping areas. These efforts improved certain areas, temporarily, but did not change the overall environment. The volume of waste produced each day far exceeded the capacity for removal, especially in growing towns where populations increased faster than infrastructure. People adapted by adjusting expectations rather than seeking transformation. They learned where to walk, where not to stand, and how to breathe through the more oppressive areas. Smells blended into the background of daily life, losing their shock as familiarity grew. Newcomers noticed the odors immediately, but residents moved through them unconsciously, guided by years of experience. This acceptance formed a crucial part of medieval urban identity. Public spaces reflected the realities of life: crowded homes, limited resources, and constant movement. Cleanliness was not a priority because survival demanded attention in other areas. To judge the streets harshly would have required a different understanding of hygiene, one that did not exist yet. Instead, the streets functioned as shared terrain, shaped by every action, every need, and every neglect. Much of medieval public life unfolded within an environment shaped by waste, discomfort, and an unspoken agreement to endure it. Yet beneath this endurance lay a recognition that the boundaries between private need and public space were fragile at best. What emerged from this tension was a household practice that revealed an even harsher truth about how people lived with their own waste. In medieval households, the management of human waste followed a logic shaped more by necessity than by privacy or sanitation. Most homes lacked designated latrines, and the few that existed were crude structures attached to outer walls or positioned above open channels. For everyone else, the simplest solution involved chamber pots, small containers kept under beds, beside hearths, or in corners where they could be reached quickly. These pots filled steadily throughout the day and night, reflecting the rhythm of daily life with an intimacy people rarely acknowledged. When the pots could no longer be ignored, their contents were dealt with in a manner that became almost ritualistic. The waste was thrown directly out of a window. The act required minimal preparation. A pot was lifted, a shutter was opened, and the liquid inside was released into the street below. The motion was practiced, efficient, and widely accepted as the normal method of disposal. The warning cry sometimes given before the waste fell, "Gardez-le," served more as a courtesy than a guarantee of safety. Many ignored it, while others reacted too slowly to avoid the sudden cascade landing in the street. Streets beneath these windows became part of the extended latrine system. Waste splashed against walls, seeped into soil, and mixed with existing layers of refuse until the ground felt permanently saturated. People walked carefully near buildings, aware that venturing too close risked an unpleasant encounter. Hats, cloaks, and baskets often bore stains from accidents no one cared to describe. The unpredictability of when and where a pot might be emptied turned every walk through narrow alleys into a quiet negotiation with chance. Homes of all classes participated in this practice. The wealthy lived in taller structures, giving their waste farther to fall. But the habit remained the same. Servants carried chamber pots to windows, dumping contents into the alleys behind kitchens or courtyards. In some grander homes, designated openings allowed waste to fall more directly, though without improving sanitation. The poor, living in cramped rooms closer to street level, emptied their pots with the same lack of ceremony. Whether waste fell from one story or three, it joined the same shared environment. The architecture of towns reinforced the habit. Streets wound tightly between clusters of buildings, often too narrow for carts to pass easily. Water drainage was limited, and sunlight struggled to reach the lower levels. The shadows concealed much of the refuse, but smells lingered regardless. Waste thrown from windows added to the layers already present, contributing to a density that defined the character of medieval urban life. People accepted the risks because alternatives required space, resources, or planning that few possessed. Those walking below adopted strategies to avoid unexpected drenchings. Some hugged the center of the street, believing it safer than the edges. Others listened for the sound of shutters moving or the faint call that sometimes preceded the fall. But these methods offered imperfect protection. A misstep, a moment of distraction, or a pot emptied without warning could soak a traveler instantly. Such incidents provoked frustration but rarely outrage. Everyone understood that they, too, would empty a pot someday. The shared experience softened anger and replaced it with resigned irritation. At night, the danger intensified. Darkness obscured movement, and people navigating narrow alleys carried lanterns that illuminated little beyond their immediate steps. Windows opened silently, releasing waste into shadows that swallowed it until it struck the ground, or someone passing beneath. Early morning walks also presented hazards, as streets bore the accumulated results of countless pots emptied before dawn. The smell rose with the warming air, settling into homes and clothing with ease. Inside households, chamber pots filled quickly. Families with several children or elderly members found themselves emptying them frequently. But the process remained simple because no one considered alternatives. Pots were rinsed only briefly, if at all, before being returned to their places. The residue settled into the material, strengthening odours over time. These pots required replacement long before they broke, not because they wore out, but because they became intolerable to handle. The practice also shaped how people perceived hygiene. Waste disposal was not seen as something that required caution or separation. It was viewed as an unavoidable part of life, managed in the most convenient way possible. The idea of contaminating streets did not alarm most households, because the streets already served as repositories for waste from animals, markets, and communal life. Human waste simply joined the mixture. Some towns attempted regulations, asking households to dispose of waste at specific times or limit dumping in busy areas. But enforcement remained weak, and necessity overrode rules. People emptied pots when they filled, regardless of hour, weather, or who might be walking below. The collective acceptance of the practice made it resistant to change. This form of disposal reveals more than the lack of sanitation infrastructure. It exposes the improvisational nature of medieval daily life. People solved immediate problems with immediate actions, rarely considering long-term consequences. Streets endured the weight of these choices, becoming both pathways and repositories for the physical realities of a densely packed population. Much of medieval waste disposal reflected a world that prioritized practicality over caution, leaving public spaces shaped by private needs. Yet beneath this routine lay an uneasy awareness that the home offered no true refuge from contamination. It became clear in bedrooms and halls, where the handling of waste continued in ways just as revealing as anything thrown into the street. Life inside medieval castles carried an air of grandeur from a distance. But the closer one moved to the private chambers of the nobility, the more those illusions unravelled. Behind stone walls and decorated tapestries, the daily realities of hygiene mirrored the same struggles found in common homes, only wrapped in richer fabric and quieter discomfort. Rooms that appeared imposing in size were often poorly ventilated, their narrow windows letting in little air and even less sunlight. The scents that accumulated from fires, sweat, food, and waste settled into the space with a heaviness that no amount of status could dispel. Bedrooms, despite their luxurious furnishings, grew thick with stale air. Heavy curtains trapped warmth but also sealed in odours that lingered through the night. Bedding absorbed the scents of bodies that rarely experienced proper washing, while carpets and tapestries clung to smoke from hearth fires that burned constantly through colder months. Courtiers and guests entering a noble chamber for the first time often noticed the density of the air, though politeness prevented them from commenting. Those who lived there adapted to the environment, their senses adjusting until discomfort blended seamlessly into routine. Chamber pots played a central role in managing bodily needs. These containers, made of metal, ceramic, or wood, sat discreetly beside beds or behind screens, ready for use at any hour. During the night, they filled quickly, especially in households where several attendants or family members shared the chamber. In grander residences, larger wooden buckets were placed in corners to accommodate multiple people, their lids helping only slightly to contain the scent. When morning arrived, servants carried these pots through quiet hallways, balancing their contents with practiced steadiness. The presence of waste within a noble bedroom did not provoke surprise, for castles were built more for defense than sanitation. Keeping waste inside the private chamber until morning felt preferable to venturing out into cold corridors or descending long staircases in the dark. The pots and buckets offered convenience, though they introduced long-lasting odours that seeped into furniture, walls, and bedding. Opening windows could provide temporary relief, but drafts were feared for their association with illness, so shutters remained closed more often than not. Servants bore the responsibility of cleaning and emptying these containers. Each morning began with the same task, carrying pots down staircases, through courtyards, or to designated disposal areas. Some castles had rudimentary latrine shafts built into their outer walls, allowing waste to fall into ditches or moats below. But many households still relied on manual disposal, requiring servants to handle the waste before rinsing the containers with limited water. The work was unpleasant, unavoidable, and performed in silence by those whose position offered no alternative. Noble families rarely considered the burden their waste placed on those who managed it. The separation between status and labour ensured that unpleasant tasks remained invisible to those who benefited from them. To the nobility, the presence of chamber pots represented comfort and order. To the servants, it marked the beginning of a long day, shaped by duties that left little time for personal care. The distinction underscored a broader truth. Privilege softened the experience of filth, but did not eliminate it. Despite grand architecture, castles struggled with waste management. Latrines built into upper floors often leaked or emitted odours that travelled through hallways. Shafts clogged, requiring repairs that were both costly and difficult. Waste from multiple floors accumulated in pits or moats, creating stagnant areas that attracted insects and emitted relentless smells. Some households burned herbs or incense to counteract these odours, but such measures merely disguised the problem, rather than addressing its source. The combination of smoke, dampness, and waste created an environment where illness thrived. Mould grew behind tapestries and along stone walls. Air circulated poorly, trapping heat and moisture that softened wood and encouraged pests. Bedding, though often made from expensive materials, absorbed sweat and oils without frequent washing. Servants aired these linens outdoors when the weather permitted, but the effort did little to overcome the deeper accumulation of grime. Visitors to castles sometimes carried romantic impressions of noble life, imagining refinement and elegance behind every door. But those who remained long enough discovered the realities of comfort in a world before sanitation. Luxury could soften beds and decorate walls, but it could not remove the waste that filled pots each night or the odours that settled into the air. A noble bedroom differed from a peasant's home only in detail. Not in principle, both coexisted with the same challenges, the same compromises, and the same acceptance of what could not be changed. The contrast between appearance and reality shaped the daily rhythms of castle life. Individuals navigated halls that smelled faintly of smoke and waste, slept in chambers that absorbed every scent, and relied on servants who began their mornings with tasks few wished to imagine. The grandeur of the setting obscured the depth of these conditions, but it did not eliminate them. Hygiene, like comfort, remained a matter of negotiation rather than achievement. Much of noble life unfolded within spaces that concealed discomfort behind wealth, allowing filth to linger despite the elegance surrounding it. Yet beneath these layers of privilege lay the same dependence on improvised solutions found in humbler homes. It became clearest in moments when the natural cycles of the body demanded care that luxury could not simplify. Menstruation in medieval life unfolded within conditions that offered women little privacy, fewer resources, and almost no understanding from the world around them. The body's natural cycle, already surrounded by discomfort, became far more difficult to manage in an environment without structured hygiene practices. Women faced these days with a mixture of endurance and resignation, knowing they would receive neither adequate tools nor social acceptance to ease the experience. The body continued its rhythms regardless, leaving women to improvise solutions in spaces that did not belong entirely to them. Without access to proper sanitary materials, women relied on cloth scraps torn from old garments or linens worn thin from years of use. These pieces were folded, layered, or wrapped in ways meant to absorb what they could, though the results were far from reliable. Cloth shifted during work, loosened during sleep, and soaked through quickly, forcing women to wash or reuse the same pieces repeatedly. Water scarcity made washing difficult, and the cold deterred them from rinsing anything thoroughly. Many avoided cloth altogether, choosing instead to bleed directly into layers of clothing or onto straw bedding. accepting the discomfort because alternatives demanded resources they did not have. The smell that accompanied menstruation lingered heavily during these days. Not because women lacked care, but because medieval life offered no environment capable of supporting proper cleanliness. Clothes saturated with sweat, dust, and weeks of wear trapped odors easily. When menstrual blood soaked into these layers, the combined scent became stronger, settling into fabrics that were rarely cleaned. Women moved through homes, fields, and markets carrying this unavoidable reminder of their cycle, aware that others could notice, but unable to alter the conditions shaping their reality. This unavoidable scent contributed to the stigma surrounding menstruation. Many communities regarded menstruating women as unclean, drawing on religious beliefs or cultural habits that labeled natural bodily processes as signs of impurity. Women were discouraged from cooking, touching sacred objects, or participating in certain activities during their cycle. Although such rules varied by region and household, their effect remained consistent. Menstruation became both a physical burden and a social isolation. Some women withdrew from communal spaces to avoid judgment, while others endured scrutiny silently because work responsibilities did not pause for their cycle. Physical discomfort intensified the experience. Cramping, fatigue, and dizziness were as common then as now. But medieval remedies sought only to dull the symptoms, not to understand them. Herbs, such as sage, mint, or yarrow were brewed into teas, believed to calm the body, though their effects depended on availability and preparation. Warmth provided relief, but fires and blankets were limited resources, reserved for the entire household rather than individual comfort. Women carried their pain quietly, knowing that acknowledging it would often be seen as weakness rather than reality. The lack of personal space heightened these challenges. Many families lived in small homes where everyone slept in the same room, making privacy impossible. Changing clothes, cleaning oneself, or tending to stains had to be done discreetly, often at night or near a dim fire where shadows concealed movement. The fear of embarrassment shaped every action. Women learned to anticipate accidents and prepared themselves mentally for moments when their clothes betrayed them. Young girls, experiencing menstruation for the first time, entered this cycle of concealment without guidance beyond what their mothers or older relatives could offer. Work did not wait for the cycle to end. Women labored in fields, kitchens, workshops, and markets, regardless of how they felt. Physical activity increased the likelihood of leaks, forcing them to adjust their movements or tighten their layers in uncomfortable ways. Heat from fires, strain from lifting, and long hours of standing intensified the burdens of menstruation. Yet women continued because survival depended on constant effort, and their discomfort held no authority capable of altering daily demands. In wealthier households, the experience differed slightly but not substantially. Cloth was more available, and laundry more frequent, but privacy remained limited, and stigma persisted. Ladies of the court hid their discomfort beneath layers of fine clothing, relying on attendants to help manage stains or discreetly replace cloth. Despite their elevated status, they too faced whispered judgment and the expectation to maintain composure in public spaces. The elegance of their garments concealed struggles identical to those endured by women working in the fields. Menstrual blood shaped superstitions as well. Some believed it carried harmful qualities capable of spoiling food or damaging crops. Others imagined it weakened women's bodies, making them vulnerable to spirits or illness. These beliefs heightened the isolation women faced, marking them as temporarily altered beings who should avoid certain tasks. Though these ideas lacked foundation, their influence persisted, reinforcing the notion that menstruation signaled impurity rather than natural function. Despite these obstacles, women developed quiet systems of support. They shared cloth scraps, whispered advice, and helped one another wash stained garments when water permitted. Within these small exchanges, they built a network of understanding that existed beneath the louder judgments of society. Their endurance reflected not acceptance of the conditions, but adaptation to a world that offered no alternatives. Much of medieval womanhood unfolded within these constraints, where natural cycles became silent burdens, shaped by scarcity and expectation. Yet beneath this endurance lay a resilience that shaped how women navigated both their bodies and their communities. What became unmistakable next was how these same limitations weighed just as heavily on the youngest members of society. Childhood in medieval life unfolded within conditions that gave little room for protection, comfort, or cleanliness. Infants and young children lived in the same crowded spaces as adults, absorbing the full reality of a world where hygiene was a distant concern. Their bodies, still fragile and forming, encountered dirt, smoke, and waste from the moment they were born. Cradles existed in some homes, but many children slept directly on packed earth floors, sharing space with animals whose closeness was valued for warmth rather than sanitation. The environment shaped their earliest experiences, imprinting survival on them before they could speak. Bathing, already rare among adults, became even less frequent for children. Water was believed to weaken their bodies, opening them to chills and illness. Instead of washing, families wiped infants with cloths or allowed dirt to accumulate because it acted as a kind of layer against the cold. Newborns were wrapped in swaddling cloths that stayed in place for long stretches, trapping sweat and waste against the skin. As the child grew, these clothes loosened, but the habits remained. Cleaning occurred only when necessary. Diapers, in the modern sense, did not exist. Cloth scraps, when available, were used to catch waste, but washing them required water and time that most households lacked. Many infants simply relieved themselves on beds of straw or directly onto the ground, where the waste mixed with soil and dried into the atmosphere of the home. The smell lingered, but people adapted quickly, regarding it as part of the natural rhythm of raising a child. Only when waste built up to unbearable levels did families rake out the straw or sweep the dirt floor. Children crawled, played, and slept among these conditions. Their hands touched animals, ashes, kitchen scraps, and floor surfaces that bore the remnants of daily life. They placed objects into their mouths, tasted dirt, and drank water that carried unseen contaminants. Adults could do little to prevent these habits. Supervision was limited, and the belief that children naturally adapted to their world reduced anxiety over such risks. Illness, when it arrived, was seen as an unavoidable part of childhood rather than the result of environmental hazards. Animals played a central role in shaping children's hygiene. Many households kept goats, chickens, pigs, or sheep indoors, especially during colder months. These animals brought warmth but also waste, parasites, and disease. Children slept near them, climbed over them, and sometimes drank directly from animal vessels because they were easier to reach than those used by adults. The constant presence of livestock kept floors damp and odorous, but families valued survival over sanitation. Space was limited, and coexistence felt necessary. Infections spread easily, without understanding germs. People attributed sickness to fate, spirits, or the imbalance of humours. Children suffered frequent bouts of fever, diarrhea, and skin irritation. Their immune systems fought endlessly against the challenges woven into their environment. Some recovered and grew stronger, many did not. The mortality rate for infants and young children remained devastatingly high, with families losing one or more children to illness before they reached adulthood. These losses shaped parental expectations, creating emotional distance in some households and deep attachment in others. Food offered little relief. Children ate from communal pots, using hands that had touched floors and animals. They consumed food contaminated by flies, dirt, and the residue of unwashed utensils. Milk soured easily, and water carried pathogens that no one could see. Herbal remedies were administered when sickness grew severe, but their effectiveness varied widely. Some children endured long periods of weakness, their bodies struggling against infections that modern knowledge could treat with ease. Others declined rapidly, leaving families to mourn silently before returning to the tasks required for survival. Despite these harsh conditions, children found moments of play and joy. They ran through fields, chased animals, and invented games from sticks, stones, and scraps of cloth. Dirt became a constant companion, settling under their nails and on their skin, shaping a physical relationship with the world that felt natural. Adults rarely intervened unless danger was obvious, trusting that exposure built resilience. The idea that cleanliness protected health had not yet formed. Instead, people focused on keeping children clothed, fed, and safe from physical accidents, leaving hygiene far from consideration. In wealthier households, the conditions improved only slightly. These homes offered more space and cleaner bedding, but the same beliefs about water and illness persisted. Children of nobility were cleaned more often, though their attendants handled the tasks with methods not much different from those used by common families. Cloths were reused, water was limited, and waste was disposed of in nearby areas. Illness still struck with frequency, and even the children of lords faced the fragility of early life. Disease recognized no social hierarchy. As children grew older, they began to accept these conditions as normal. They learned when to ignore discomfort, how to navigate dirty spaces, and when illness threatened their strength. The habits they formed during early childhood shaped their approach to hygiene in adulthood, reinforcing cycles that continued through generations. Survival required adaptation, not transformation, and children adapted quickly. Much of medieval childhood unfolded within environments where dirt and illness shaped every stage of early life. Yet beneath these harsh conditions lay a quiet endurance that allowed families to continue despite constant loss. Even more revealing was how that endurance evolved into practices of devotion that embraced discomfort as a sign of piety. Pilgrimage in medieval life unfolded across long distances, harsh landscapes, and an unbroken acceptance of physical hardship that shaped not only the bodies of travelers, but the very air surrounding them. Those who undertook the journey walked for weeks or months, moving from village to village with few possessions and even fewer opportunities for rest. Their clothing, worn at the start with intention, soon became layered with sweat, dust, and rain until the fabric stiffened and darkened. Each new step added another trace of the road, marking their bodies with the unmistakable scent of endurance. Bathing rarely occurred along these routes. Travelers slept in fields, barns, or on the ground beside roads, where water, if present at all, was reserved for drinking. Streams offered brief relief when conditions allowed, but many avoided full immersion for fear of illness or weakness. Instead, dirt settled onto their skin and hair, forming a second layer that thickened with time. Their hands bore the residue of touching earth, stone, and rough wood. Their feet carried the imprint of miles travelled without rest. The body adapted to discomfort, but the scent of prolonged travel deepened steadily. Clothing, worn continuously, absorbed every element encountered along the way. Pilgrims wore wool cloaks, linen shirts, and coarse tunics that trapped moisture from rain or morning dew. These layers rarely dried completely, especially during colder seasons, leaving garments perpetually damp. As sweat accumulated beneath them, the fibers clung to the skin, creating a mixture of odors that lingered even when travelers reached towns or rest houses. The smell became a part of their identity, signaling both fatigue and devotion. Communal shelters did little to improve conditions. Pilgrims gathered in crowded rooms or barns offered by monasteries or villagers willing to provide shelter. Inside these spaces, the combined scent of unwashed bodies, damp clothing, and drying boots filled the air. People lie side by side on straw or wooden floors, sharing warmth and discomfort in equal measure. The closeness intensified odors, but those present accepted the environment without complaint, believing it to be part of the spiritual price of the journey. Over time, the smell associated with pilgrims took on meaning beyond physical neglect. Some regarded it as a sign of humility, evidence that a traveler had renounced comfort to pursue spiritual renewal. The scent, unpleasant to outsiders, became framed as a kind of holy aroma, marking individuals who had chosen hardship over ease. Clergy in certain regions encouraged this perspective, teaching that suffering and discomfort deepened penitence. The idea spread, reinforcing the belief that the body's natural decline during pilgrimage reflected inward purification. This belief carried a powerful social effect. Villagers who encountered pilgrims often showed them respect, offering food or a place to sleep despite the odor that accompanied them. Children watched from doorways as travelers passed through, recognizing them by the distinctive scent that clung to their clothes and belongings. Though some individuals recoiled from the smell, most saw it as part of the broader cultural understanding of pilgrimage. It represented sacrifice, sincerity, and steadfastness in the face of physical challenge. Pilgrims themselves internalized these associations. Many felt that enduring discomfort without complaint brought them closer to spiritual ideals. They viewed the neglect of bathing or washing as a conscious choice rather than an unavoidable consequence of the road. Some believed that washing away the accumulated dirt would also wash away the humility gained through hardship. Others feared that cleansing the body would weaken the resolve needed to complete the journey. This mindset transformed physical neglect into ritual practice, strengthening the identity of pilgrims as individuals set apart from ordinary life. The scent also shaped how pilgrims understood one another. In gathering places, they recognized shared struggles through smell alone. Long miles walked, sleepless nights endured, and weather survived. These shared experiences fostered a sense of community that did not require words. People exchanged stories softly by firelight, their voices barely rising above the sound of wind or distant animals. They offered encouragement through gestures rather than comfort, knowing each person's burden could not be eased easily. However, the consequences of neglect remained undeniable. Skin irritation, tea infections, and sores grew common, especially in areas rubbed constantly by rough fabric. Feet cracked and bled from long hours on uneven surfaces. Hair tangled into unmanageable knots, trapping sweat and dust. Some travelers collapsed from exhaustion or illness before completing their journeys. Others pressed onward despite pain, driven by vows, faith, or the hope of absolution. Their scent, growing stronger with every mile, signaled both resilience and vulnerability. To those watching from the outside, the smell of pilgrims symbolized a boundary between everyday life and spiritual striving. It reminded communities that faith sometimes demanded more from the body than people were prepared to endure. Pilgrims walked through towns marked by visible and invisible burdens, dirt on their clothes, fatigue in their steps, and devotion in the weight they carried forward. Much of the pilgrim's identity emerged from this union of hardship, faith, and the physical decay of the long road. Yet beneath the reverence shown to them lay the reality that not all who embraced deprivation did so voluntarily. The clearest example surfaced within monastic walls, where vows turned neglect into a daily ritual of its own. Life inside medieval monastic communities unfolded under rules that sought spiritual purity through simplicity, restraint, and detachment from worldly concerns. Yet the interpretation of these values often extended into physical neglect, shaping habits that blurred the line between devotion and deprivation. Many monks and nuns believed that distancing themselves from bodily comfort strengthened their spiritual discipline. Washing, therefore, became not just unnecessary, but potentially harmful, an indulgence that risked distracting the soul from its higher purpose. The body, they felt, should not be pampered if the spirit was to remain firm. Bathing occurred rarely, sometimes only a few times a year, and in certain orders, not at all, unless illness demanded intervention. Some monks avoided water deliberately, convinced that keeping the skin closed protected them from temptation or weakness. They believed that cleansing the body created softness, and softness invited indulgence. Dirt accumulated gradually, forming a layer that came to represent both humility and endurance. The smell that rose from unwashed skin or hair was accepted as part of monastic life, something the community understood collectively rather than judged individually. Monasteries themselves intensified these conditions, built with thick stone walls, small windows, and minimal ventilation. These structures trapped moisture and odors easily. Daily activities, prayer, cooking, study, and sleep occurred in proximity, and the air grew dense as the day progressed. Dampness settled into wooden benches, straw bedding, and woven robes, creating a musty scent that clung to every room. Mold thrived in corners where sunlight rarely reached, blending with the lingering odor of bodies that had not touched water in weeks or months. Living in enclosed communities meant that personal scent became part of the shared atmosphere. Monks sat side by side during prayers, their breaths warming the air around them. Clothing, rarely washed, trapped sweat and oils that deepened in smell over time. Communal dining halls concentrated these odors further, while narrow dormitories held them through the night. The environment shaped the senses gradually, dulling reactions to discomfort, until the smell of damp robes or unwashed skin felt natural, even comforting in its familiarity. Robes, often made of coarse wool, absorbed everything the monks' bodies released. Sweat soaked into the fibers during labor in fields or workrooms. Smoke from hearths settled onto fabric during meals or winter gatherings. Rain dampened the outer layers during travel between monastic buildings, and the wet cloth rarely dried quickly in the cool air. Over time, the robes stiffened and darkened, carrying the weight of months or years without washing. Patches were added when the fabric tore, but cleaning remained rare. Sleeping conditions added another layer to the lack of hygiene. Monks often slept in communal halls, lying on straw mattresses that were replaced infrequently. The straw absorbed moisture from bodies, spilled liquids, and the humidity of the room itself. As the months passed, insects made their home inside the bedding, feeding on debris that collected inside. Changing or shaking out the straw occurred only when necessary, as resources and labor were limited. The resulting mix of dust, mold, and insects became part of nightly rest. Despite these hardships, many monks believed that enduring physical discomfort strengthened their spiritual resolve. They interpreted the smell rising from their bodies as a reminder of mortality and humility. Cleanliness of the soul, they argued, mattered infinitely more than cleanliness of the flesh. Some writings from the period even praised those who avoided bathing entirely, viewing their odor as a badge of devotion. This belief encouraged practices that, while spiritually symbolic, exposed monks to illness and infection without their awareness. Illness spreads easily in these conditions. Respiratory problems flourished in damp, poorly ventilated rooms. Skin infections became common, especially among those whose robes never dried fully. Shared tools, books, and eating utensils passed germs between community members without notice. Yet illness did not always disrupt routines. Many saw sickness as a test of faith or the will of a higher power. Remedies focused on prayer and herbs rather than improving hygiene or sanitation. Visitors to monasteries often noticed the smell immediately. They described musty halls, heavy air, and the pungent scent of bodies that had long lived without washing. Yet they also spoke of the monks' calm demeanour, their quiet routines, and their unwavering commitment to spiritual life. The contrast between devotion and physical neglect created an atmosphere that felt both serene and unsettling, an environment where discomfort became a path to transcendence. Not all monastic communities embraced such extreme practices. Some orders encouraged bathing when resources allowed, understanding that hygiene supported health and productivity. But these exceptions did little to alter the broader perception of monastic life as one defined by austerity, sacrifice, and an intentional distancing from bodily needs. The body served as a vessel to be endured, not maintained. Much of monastic devotion unfolded within spaces where physical neglect became intertwined with spiritual aspiration. Yet beneath this discipline lay an environment that eroded health as steadily as it shaped faith. It soon became clear that these beliefs about purity influenced not only monastic life, but the wider world's understanding of suffering and sanctity. Religious ideas shaped daily choices across medieval Europe, guiding not only prayer and rituals, but also the physical behavior of the body itself. Many people believed that suffering purified the soul, and from this belief grew a quiet acceptance of discomfort, dirt, and physical neglect. The body was viewed as temporary and flawed, a vessel whose desires needed to be restrained if the spirit was to remain strong. Cleanliness, comfort, and sensory ease became entangled with suspicion, as though tending too carefully to the body risked indulging the self. Within this mindset, hygiene ceased to be a practical necessity and became a question of morality instead. Bathing, especially, carried moral weight. For some, washing was harmless as long as it was done sparingly. For others, it was a dangerous doorway to vanity, pleasure, and distraction. Clean skin could be interpreted as indulgence. Warm water, especially, raised concerns. It soothed muscles, relaxed the body, and introduced sensations that religious leaders feared might awaken worldly desires. Over time, this suspicion hardened into a cultural hesitation, shaping how people approached the simple act of washing. Dirt was not merely tolerated, it became a symbol of restraint. The belief that physical suffering purified the soul encouraged practices that today appear unusual or even harmful. Some individuals intentionally avoided washing to feel the discomfort as a reminder of their spiritual journey. Others embraced scratchy clothing, cold rooms, and long fasts as means of discipline. This approach spread across different regions and communities, reinforcing a shared belief that hygiene belonged to the realm of luxury rather than necessity. Ordinary people followed these ideas because they trusted spiritual authorities, but also because life itself was hard and resources were limited. Accepting discomfort felt natural in a world where comfort was scarce. In many villages, the idea that suffering built virtue shaped how parents raised their children. A child who endured cold mornings, unwashed bodies, or rough clothing was believed to grow stronger in both spirit and character. Cleanliness, by contrast, seemed fragile, something that belonged to the wealthy, the idle, or the morally questionable. Dirt became so normal that people rarely questioned its presence. Skin caked with dust, hair heavy with oil, and clothing worn for weeks without washing blended seamlessly into everyday life. The religious framing simply reinforced what poverty had already made familiar. Clergy members often encouraged these attitudes through sermons and teachings. They warned that bathing too frequently drew attention to the body, undermining humility and inviting temptation. They praised saints who endured harsh physical conditions and interpreted suffering as a divine test. These stories circulated widely, shaping the expectations of ordinary believers. A clean body carried the risk of pride. A dirty one represented humility and endurance. This message resonated strongly in communities struggling with labor, illness, and scarcity. It gave meaning to discomfort, turning hardship into spiritual merit. Mystics and ascetics intensified these ideas by living lives of deliberate austerity. Some avoided water entirely, believing that denying the body any comfort brought them closer to the divine. Their examples, though extreme, inspired admiration and imitation. A person who endured discomfort without complaint was seen as virtuous. Over time, their behavior influenced the broader culture, reinforcing a connection between physical neglect and spiritual strength. Even people who did not follow ascetic practices directly still felt the weight of these ideas, shaping their own habits through inherited belief. Bathing also raised concerns about health from a moral standpoint. Many feared that water opened the pores, allowing illness or evil influences to enter the body. This belief grew stronger during outbreaks of disease, when communities associated bathing with vulnerability, choosing not to wash, therefore, felt like an act of caution as well as spiritual discipline. People preferred dry methods of cleansing, rubbing the skin with cloth, or powders, rather than exposing themselves to water. These habits aligned with religious teachings, merging practicality and belief into a single way of life. In wealthier households, the influence of religious attitudes is mixed with social expectations. A noble might have access to warm water, scented oils, and privacy, but religious pressure encouraged restraint. Excessive bathing could be interpreted as vanity. Servants sometimes prepared water for their employers, yet the act itself remained rare. Clothing absorbed sweat for long periods, and rooms retained odors from both people and animals. The belief that spiritual purity outweighed physical cleanliness created an environment where even privilege did not guarantee hygiene. Urban populations faced additional challenges. Public baths existed in some cities, but their reputation became tarnished by associations with immorality. Religious leaders warned that these places encouraged indulgence and inappropriate behavior. As moral suspicion grew, authorities ordered many such establishments to close. With fewer public facilities, people bathed less frequently. The decline of communal bathing reinforced the idea that cleanliness was unnecessary or even dangerous. The line between spiritual discipline and public hygiene blurred until avoidance became the norm. Despite these widespread beliefs, there were moments when practical needs overpowered moral teaching. Midwives washed their hands during childbirth when possible. Craftsmen cleaned their tools out of necessity. But these exceptions did little to challenge the broader framework that tied physical discomfort to virtue. The body, after all, was temporary, the soul eternal. In that comparison, cleanliness seemed trivial. Much of medieval belief intertwined spiritual virtue with physical neglect, allowing discomfort to become a quiet measure of devotion. Yet beneath this acceptance lay a tension between faith and survival that families navigated daily. Slip further into that world, and another practice appears, one that blended fragrance, deception, and the struggle to mask what life refused to hide. Scents drifted quietly through medieval households, not as luxuries meant to celebrate beauty, but as shields shaped by necessity. People lived with layers of sweat, smoke, damp wool, and unwashed skin. And fragrance became one of the few ways to soften what their world refused to remove. Nobles relied heavily on herbs, dried flowers, and oils to create small pockets of comfort within their castles and halls. These scents were meant to mask, not eliminate, the odors that clung to bodies and rooms. The effort revealed a culture that accepted dirt as constant, but still longed for moments of relief. Wealthier families often carried fragrance close to the skin. Small sachets of dried lavender, rosemary, rose petals, or mint were sewn into clothing or tied at the waist. These bundles rarely offered true cleanliness, but they created the illusion of refinement. The layers of wool and linen worn throughout long seasons trapped heat and dampness. Scented sachets softened some of that burden. People learned to move with these small pouches as though they were part of the body, quietly releasing their fragrance with each step. The scent became a marker of status, separating those who could afford herbs from those who endured the world unfiltered. Oil-based perfumes were used with even more intention. Nobles applied these oils to the hairline, the back of the neck, or along the sleeves where fabric brushed the skin most often. Warmth intensified the scent, helping it spread through rooms that rarely benefited from fresh air. The oils served both personal comfort and social purpose, signaling that the wearer belonged to a class that could afford small luxuries. Yet these perfumes did little to change underlying conditions. They mixed with sweat instead of replacing it, forming layers of fragrance and odor that followed people through their daily routines. The preparation of scents itself carried its own risks. Some mixtures relied on ingredients that modern understanding would label dangerous. Lead compounds, mercury-based substances, and strong resins appeared in certain perfumes because they enhanced longevity or gave a desired sharpness. People applied these directly to their skin without knowing the long-term effects. Over time, these elements could irritate, weaken, or even poison the body. Still, fragrance remained desirable, and danger blended into daily life alongside dirt and illness. The effort to smell pleasant was rarely separate from the possibility of harm. Many nobles stored scented objects in their living spaces to fight the constant presence of stale air. Dried herbs hung near beds. Carved wooden boxes filled with flowers rested on tables, and perfumed cloths were tucked into chests of clothing. Wealthier families used incense during gatherings, partly for ceremony and partly to mask the odors rising from crowded rooms. These practices gave temporary comfort, but did not address the conditions that produced the smells to begin with. Rooms lacked proper ventilation. Fires burned day and night, and bodies remained largely unwashed. Fragrance acted as a veil, thin enough to slip, but necessary enough to maintain. Travel brought its own challenges. People on long journeys, especially nobles, carried scented items in pouches or pockets to soften the harshness of inns, stables, and crowded lodgings. The smell of animals, sweat, and damp straw mixed heavily in these places. A small sachet or vial of oil offered a sense of personal boundary. However fragile, it reminded travelers of their social identity even when far from home. Fragrance became a way to maintain dignity in environments where dirt overwhelmed everything. In religious settings, scents played symbolic and practical roles. Churches burned incense as part of rituals, filling the air with heavy, lingering fragrance. While the scent carried spiritual meaning, it also softened the odors of congregants who rarely bathed. Monasteries used herbal mixtures to prepare rooms or mask the mustiness that came from enclosed stone structures. These fragrant practices connected faith with sensory relief, offering comfort without challenging the deeper cultural acceptance of dirt. Women had a distinct relationship with scents. Social expectations demanded that noble women appear refined, despite the same hygiene limitations faced by everyone else. They used scented pins, ribbon sachets, and perfumed oils to maintain a cultivated presence. Yet the fragrances could not fully mask sweat, trapped under multiple layers of heavy clothing. A woman might adjust her sleeves or collar throughout the day to refresh the air around her, relying on scent to support the illusion of constant grace. These efforts were subtle but essential to navigating court life. Markets offered inexpensive, fragrant items to common people, though these were often crude in preparation. Bundles of dried herbs or simple powders promised sweetness at a low cost. Some mixtures included toxic or irritating ingredients. Yet buyers accepted the risk because any improvement felt worthwhile. People living in crowded homes with limited airflow longed for relief, even momentary. Scents became part of the rhythm of survival, a quiet tool for transforming the immediate world into something bearable. Through all of this, fragrance became a symbol of aspiration. It suggested a life beyond the smells of labor, illness, and poverty. Even when dangerous or ineffective, scented items offered a sense of control that hygiene itself could not provide. People clung to these objects because they softened reality, creating small islands of comfort in a landscape shaped by dirt. Much of the reliance on fragrances revealed a world where scent was used less for beauty and more for hiding what daily life could not escape. Yet beneath every perfumed layer lingered the quiet knowledge that masking a problem never removed its cause. Most unsettling of all was how these habits shaped the very places meant to offer healing, where cleansing was replaced by practices rooted in belief rather than care. Medical practice in medieval Europe unfolded in an atmosphere shaped more by belief than by understanding, and the absence of hygiene was woven into every step of treatment. Physicians approached illness through the lens of bad air, convinced that disease drifted through the world as a poisonous mist rather than as something that could be carried on hands, tools, or clothing. This belief shaped their behavior so deeply that washing was rarely considered necessary. Even in the presence of blood or open wounds, the sick were handled with hands that had touched countless bodies before them, and no one questioned whether these hands might carry danger. Treatment rooms were often dim, closed spaces meant to keep out cold drafts. Yet these sealed interiors trapped the odors of sweat, sickness, and damp straw, creating a stagnant environment where illness circulated freely. Beds were reused without proper cleaning, and linens held the marks of previous patients. The idea that disease could cling to surfaces had not yet taken root. Physicians, monks, and healers walked through these spaces unconcerned, believing that their task was to balance internal humors rather than to maintain external cleanliness. Surgical practices made the absence of hygiene even more stark. Instruments such as knives, saws, and needles were handled as everyday tools, used repeatedly without washing. A blade that cuts through infected flesh in the morning might be used on a healthy patient by afternoon. Blood accumulated on surfaces, dried into cracks in wooden tables, and gathered beneath straw-covered floors. Surgeons worked quickly, not out of caution but out of pride. Speed was considered a mark of expertise. Patients who survived the shock and pain of an operation often developed infections that no one understood, and their decline was attributed to fate rather than contamination. Dentistry carried similar risks. Teeth were pulled with tools that had touched dozens of mouths without cleaning. Splinters of bone, droplets of saliva, and traces of infection adhered to metal edges, carried from one patient to another. Those who came seeking relief from tooth pain frequently left with fevers or swollen wounds. Yet the connection between poor hygiene and worsening illness remained invisible to medieval healers, who saw the body as a vessel influenced more by air and spirit than by contact and cleanliness. Physicians themselves were trained within a system that valued ancient texts over direct observation. Much of their learning came from works written centuries earlier, repeated without question. These texts focused on balancing humors, instructing healers to purge, bleed, or apply herbal mixtures. Washing hands or tools was never mentioned in these manuscripts, and so the practice never became routine. Illness was viewed as an internal imbalance, not as something that could be introduced from without. Hospitals, where they existed, resembled crowded shelters more than places of healing. Beds were placed close together, patients shared air and blankets, and ventilation openings were small. Caretakers moved from bed to bed without washing, touching wounds, adjusting bandages, and carrying the traces of one person's sickness into the life of another. For many, Entering a hospital meant stepping into a place where illness multiplied rather than receded. The smell of decay settled into every corner, becoming part of the daily atmosphere. Clergy often served as healers, guided by spiritual interpretations of disease. They viewed illness as a test of faith or a consequence of sin, a moral condition rather than a medical one. Their focus rested on prayers, relics, and rituals. They offered comfort to the suffering, but paid little attention to physical sanitation. Monastic infirmaries housed the sick in rooms where air circulated poorly, and bedding was rarely cleaned. Priests moved between the infirmary and the chapel in robes that absorbed the scents and fluids of sickness, carrying them through sacred spaces without awareness. Midwives and local healers faced similar limitations. They delivered babies in homes with dirt floors and little light, using cloths that had been washed only when water was available. Their tools might be wiped on garments or rinsed quickly, but thorough cleaning was rare. Mothers and infants often died from infections no one could explain. Communities grieved, but they accepted these losses as ordinary parts of life. All of this unfolded in a world where dirt was so common that its dangers felt invisible. People lived with animals, stored waste in open pits, and walked through streets lined with refuse. The idea that disease could travel on hands or tools simply did not exist. Without that understanding, medical practice focused on what could be seen and felt: pain, heat, swelling, while ignoring the unseen forces that shaped survival. Healing, as medieval people understood it, relied on endurance, faith, and inherited methods rather than cleanliness. Lives were saved at times through luck or natural resilience, but many were lost because the smallest precautions had not yet entered human knowledge. It was a world where the boundary between care and harm was thin, shaped more by tradition than by caution. Much of medieval medical practice revealed a system built on belief rather than protection, where hygiene played almost no role in preventing harm. Yet beneath these routines lay a quiet acceptance that suffering was unavoidable, shaping every decision made around the sick. What came afterward exposed an even deeper divide, where scent itself became a marker of power and class. The tension between scent and status shaped medieval society in ways that were both subtle and unmistakable. People lived in an environment where dirt was constant, and sweat clung to every layer of fabric. Yet the meaning of these odours varied sharply, depending on who carried them. The poor were surrounded by smells born from labour, animals, and cramped living, and these scents became markers that others used to define them. Filth was seen not simply as a physical condition, but as a reflection of one's place in the world. Those who lived near refuse pits, worked in fields, or slept in shared rooms were judged through the air around them long before anyone considered the hardships that shaped their lives. The wealthy observed these differences and built their identity around escaping them, although they too lived in castles where waste was stored in buckets, where narrow halls trapped damp air, and where cleanliness was still limited by water scarcity. Their scents were curated. They carried small pouches filled with herbs or dried flowers, stitched into clothing or tied at the waist. These fragrances did little to change their surroundings, but they created personal boundaries, a way of distancing themselves from the people they considered beneath them. The contrast between natural odour and manufactured scent became a quiet social language. In markets and public squares, this distinction was easily noticed. A labourer who approached smelling of earth and sweat was judged before a word was spoken. The scent of toil marked him as poor, and no amount of effort or dignity altered that perception. Meanwhile, a noblewoman walking through the same street carried hints of rose or clove, scents that announced her status, even in places where mud and smoke overwhelmed everything else. Smell became a signal, one that shaped how people were greeted, respected, or avoided. Inside homes, the pattern continued. Families who struggled to survive rarely had access to herbs or oils. Their clothing absorbed the odors of daily life: cooking fires, damp straw, unwashed skin. Each layer added to the perception that they were inherently unclean. Cleanliness was not measured by water or soap, but by how far one could distance oneself from the natural smells of existence. The poor were trapped in a cycle where scent became both a consequence and a condemnation. The wealthy used perfume not only to mask reality, but to project an identity. Fragrances were chosen carefully, blended from imported oils and rare flowers. These scents signaled refinement and restraint, creating an illusion of purity that did not reflect the conditions of medieval architecture or sanitation. Their castles still held the odor of waste. Their rooms trapped stale air. Yet their personal scent allowed them to pretend otherwise. Through this illusion, the divide between classes deepened. In churches, scent became a symbol of virtue. Incense filled the air during rituals, surrounding the clergy with perfumed smoke that suggested holiness and separation from the world. Meanwhile, common worshippers stood in their natural order, a reminder of their place in both earthly and spiritual hierarchies. Smell reinforced moral judgments as easily as it reinforced economic ones. The poor were told that their hardships were part of divine order, and their scent, a result of these hardships, became part of that order as well. The association between odor and morality shaped everyday interactions. A person who smelled strongly of sweat might be seen as lacking discipline, even though labor demanded long hours of exertion. A noble who smelled of herbs could be viewed as refined, even if their daily habits differed little from those they judged. Scent, rather than behavior, became the basis for assumptions. This quiet system of classification influenced relationships, opportunities, and expectations, leaving little room for anyone to challenge it. In social gatherings, the contrast became most apparent. Feasts held in drafty halls filled the air with the smell of roasted meat, spilled ale, and unwashed bodies. Yet the nobles seated at the upper tables carried fragrances meant to distinguish them from the rest. Servants who delivered food moved in and out of these scented boundaries, their natural odors meeting the nobles' perfumes in a silent collision that underscored the distance between them. It was not etiquette or intelligence that separated classes at such moments. It was the air itself. For the poor, this system was impossible to escape. They walked through streets where waste lined the gutters, lived in rooms with damp timber walls, and worked in environments where water was scarce. Their scent was shaped by necessity, not choice, and because scent was judged more than context, they remained trapped in a space where odor defined identity. In a world where dirt was everywhere, it was not the presence of filth that determined status, but the ability to disguise it. This unspoken reliance on smell as a social marker was one of the most enduring forms of medieval hierarchy. People learned to read one another not by clothing alone, but by the faint traces left in the air. Every meeting, every greeting, every first impression carried the weight of scent-based judgment. In a society that embraced dirt as unavoidable, scent became a subtle form of power. Much of medieval life revealed a world where scent served not as a simple condition, but as a quiet instrument of hierarchy. Yet beneath these distinctions lay a truth that people rarely admitted. Everyone lived within the same air, breathing the same mix of smoke, sweat, and decay. More revealing still was how this shared reality shaped the final understanding of filth as a destiny rather than a flaw. Cleanliness in medieval Europe existed more as an aspiration than a reality, and for most people, it remained forever out of reach. Daily life unfolded in an environment where dirt was constant, water was scarce, and hygiene depended more on circumstance than on choice. The rare individuals who managed to keep themselves relatively clean did so not through discipline or preference, but through access to servants, to private wells, to scented oils, and to living spaces with ventilation. For everyone else, Filth became an inseparable part of existence, woven into the rhythms of work, sleep, faith, and survival. The air people breathed carried the scent of the world around them. Smoke drifted through narrow streets, clinging to clothing and settling into hair. Animal waste mixed with mud along uneven roads. Fires burned indoors with little regard for ventilation, leaving homes heavy with the smell of damp wood and lingering heat. Even those who tried to wash found that the world around them would replace that cleanliness within hours. Dirt returned as quickly as it was removed, reminding them that cleanliness was not a state, but a moment. Religion shaped how people understood these conditions. The idea that suffering purified the soul made discomfort feel purposeful rather than accidental. Priests spoke of humility as a virtue and warned that indulgence, including the indulgence of feeling clean, might lead the mind astray. Many believed that the body's natural odors were part of the human condition, and that trying to escape them risked pride or temptation. Spiritual language grew around the presence of filth, turning physical hardship into moral symbolism. People accepted the weight of dirt on their skin as part of their path towards salvation. Society reinforced this mindset through class expectations. Those born into poverty lived close to livestock, slept on floors lined with straw, and worked in conditions where sweat dried into their clothing day after day. Filth was not simply unavoidable, it was used as evidence of their place in the hierarchy. Those with wealth masked their own odors with herbs and oils, projecting an illusion of superiority. The contrast was not one of actual cleanliness, but of scent. The poor smelled of labor and survival, while the wealthy smelled of curated fragrances. Underneath, however, both groups lived in a world where genuine cleanliness was nearly impossible. Resource scarcity played an equally significant role. Water sources were often polluted, and the effort required to fetch clean water demanded time and strength that many could not spare. Firewood, essential for heating water, was expensive or difficult to gather. Soap, when available, was harsh and limited in supply. Clothing required long hours to wash and dry. Most people simply could not afford the labor. Because of these constraints, washing became a rare event rather than a routine. Dirt accumulated on skin, on fabrics, on hair, and people adapted by changing their expectations instead of their habits. The human nose grew accustomed to these conditions. Living in constant odor dulled the senses. People stopped noticing what surrounded them unless the smell was extreme. A household might carry the scent of stale air, damp walls, and unwashed bedding, but for those who lived within it, that scent became background, as unremarkable as the sound of a market or the creaking of floorboards. Smell lost its ability to shock, and instead it blended into the structure of daily life. What may seem unthinkable now felt ordinary then. Children grew up within these scents. Adults aged within them. Communities formed their identities around an acceptance of the environment. Hygiene was not measured by the absence of dirt, but by the ability to endure it. People moved through the world with the quiet understanding that suffering, discomfort, and filth were simply part of being alive. When sickness spread through towns or villages, no one considered the role hygiene might have played. Disease was seen as divine will or an unavoidable fate. The connection between cleanliness and health had not yet been uncovered, and so people repeated the same patterns for generations. They washed infrequently, shared crowded spaces, and breathed the same air without realizing how these habits shaped their survival. Every outbreak reinforced the belief that death was unpredictable rather than preventable. The structure of medieval life left little room for change. Homes were built close together, markets overflowed with refuse, and animals lived alongside humans. Water sources passed through fields and pastures before reaching homes. Travelers carried odors from one town to another, embedding the same scents across regions. Filth became a language shared by all classes. Old professions, all ages. It was a condition of the body and a condition of the world. Even those who attempted to maintain cleanliness could not escape their environment. A person who washed might step outside into air filled with the smell of tanneries, stables, or smoke. Rain turned streets into rivers of mud mixed with waste. Heat caused smells to rise from alleys and cellars. Cleanliness was temporary and fragile, undone by a single step or breath. People learned not to chase it. This acceptance shaped their understanding of reality. Instead of seeing filth as a problem, they viewed it as a natural state. Instead of striving for purity, they learned resilience. The scents of medieval life, some sharp, some heavy, some almost metallic, became markers of familiarity. They defined places, professions, seasons, and communities. They formed part of the memory of childhood and the backdrop of adulthood. Looking back, it is easy to judge these conditions, to imagine that people suffered because they lacked knowledge or resources. But within their own world, filth was not a sign of failure. It was simply the landscape of life. Cleanliness was a luxury granted to a few, while endurance was the reality for many. The boundary between being clean and unclean was not a moral or personal decision. It was determined by economics, geography, belief, and the limits of medieval knowledge. And that is the unsettling truth. The things that shock us now were once so ordinary that no one questioned them. Dirt, odor, and decay were not exceptions. They were constants. Medieval Europe lived within a world where filth shaped identity, community, and expectation. The scent of life was also the scent of hardship. Cleanliness was rare enough to feel miraculous. Filth was common enough to feel inevitable. In the end, smell itself became fate. It determined how people were perceived, how they lived, and how they died. And in a world without the knowledge to change these conditions, people accepted their fate with a quiet resilience that shaped centuries of daily life. Thank you for staying through this long descent into the intimate reality of medieval hygiene. May the silence of the night soften the images, and may your rest be gentler than the world you just walked through. Good night. Sleep well,